Hello, dear listener, and welcome to this quiet corner where stories unfold like whispered secrets in the darkness, where mysteries drift through the air like smoke from a dying candle, and where sleep comes gently, peacefully, wrapped in the soft embrace of Victorian London. Tonight, I invite you to journey with me into a tale of ancient curses, forgotten chambers, and the brilliant mind of Mr. Sherlock Holmes as he unravels a mystery that begins in the hallowed halls of the British Museum and extends into realms both historical and inexplicable. This story is designed to help you release the day's tensions, to slow your racing thoughts, and to guide you toward restful, peaceful slumber. Perhaps you're listening from across the ocean, or perhaps from just across the way. Wherever you find yourself tonight, know that this space is yours, warm and safe and welcoming. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain falls softly against the windows of 221B Baker Street, each droplet creating a gentle rhythm that speaks of autumn's arrival in London, of evenings growing longer and darker, of mist creeping through cobblestone streets where gas lamps cast their amber glow across puddles that shimmer like liquid gold. Inside this sanctuary of reason and investigation, the fire crackles with quiet contentment in the hearth, its flames dancing shadows across book-lined walls, across the Persian slipper containing tobacco, across the violin resting in its case like a sleeping instrument awaiting its master's touch. The sitting room exists in that perfect state of lived-in comfort. Papers scattered across the desk beside chemical apparatus, the scent of old leather mingling with wood smoke, and the faint aroma of Mrs. Hudson's cooking drifting up from below, everything familiar and reassuring in its constancy. Doctor. John Watson sits in his customary armchair, the one positioned nearest the fire's warmth, his legs crossed at the ankle, a medical journal resting open upon his lap, though his attention has drifted from the printed words to the mesmerizing patterns within the flames themselves. The doctor has returned from his rounds this October evening, feeling the particular weariness that comes not from excessive labour, but from the steady accumulation of small concerns. Patients with seasonal ailments, elderly women worried about the approaching winter, children with coughs that require more reassurance than medicine. His hand rests against the chair's arm, fingers idly tracing the worn fabric, his breathing slow and measured as he allows himself this moment of peace. Sherlock Holmes occupies the opposite chair, his long frame arranged in that peculiar manner he favours when deep in thought, body reclined, fingertips pressed together, forming a cathedral before his face, grey eyes half closed, yet somehow intensely focused upon something only he perceives. He has remained in this position for the better part of an hour, having finished his after-dinner pipe, the smoke now dissipated into the room's atmosphere, leaving only the ghostly memory of its passage. Watson knows better than to interrupt these contemplative silences. He has learned through years of companionship that Holmes's mind works in mysterious patterns, pursuing threads of logic through labyrinths that would confound lesser intellects, arriving at conclusions that seem miraculous until explained with his characteristic clarity. The clock upon the mantelpiece ticks steadily, marking the passage of time with mechanical precision, its brass face catching firelight. The hour hand approaching 9 o'clock on this Thursday evening. Outside, London continues its eternal rhythm, the distant clatter of carriage wheels on wet pavement, The muffled call of a street vendor closing his cart for the night. The whispered conversations of passers-by hurrying home through the rain. But here, in this upstairs sanctuary, time moves differently, more slowly, as though the room itself exists slightly apart from the city's relentless forward motion. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps sound upon the stairs, her familiar tread announcing her approach, before her gentle knock disturbs the silence. "Come in, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes calls, without opening his eyes, without altering his meditative posture. And Watson smiles slightly at this small demonstration of his friend's awareness. The way Holmes tracks every sound and movement, even when appearing completely abstracted from his surroundings. The door opens slowly, its hinges creating the softest whisper of protest, and their landlady enters carrying a tea tray, her grey hair neatly arranged beneath her cap, her expression holding that mixture of fond exasperation and maternal concern she reserves specifically for her peculiar tenants. "I've brought fresh tea, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she says quietly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of one who has long managed this household's daily rhythms. "And some of those biscuits you favour, Doctor, though heaven knows whether either of you will remember to eat them before they grow cold." Watson rises to assist her, taking the tray and setting it upon the table between the chairs, the delicate china rattling softly with the movement. "You're very kind, Mrs. Hudson," he murmurs, genuinely appreciative of these small comforts she provides, without being asked, the way she anticipates their needs with quiet efficiency. The tea releases aromatic steam into the air. Black tea with bergamot, Earl Grey, its scent mingling with the room's other fragrances, to create that particular atmosphere Watson has come to associate with home, with safety, with the pleasant drowsiness of evening settling into night. "Will you be requiring anything else?" Mrs. Hudson inquires, her hands smoothing her apron, her gaze travelling between the two men, with the practiced assessment of one who has learned to read their moods and requirements through years of observation. "Nothing, thank you," Holmes replies, still maintaining his contemplative position, though one eye opens slightly to regard their landlady with what might be interpreted as warmth from someone less habitually reserved. "You should retire early yourself, Mrs. Hudson. The rain will continue through the night, and there is a chill developing that speaks of winter's approach." She nods, pleased by this rare expression of consideration, and departs as quietly as she arrived, pulling the door closed behind her until only a thin line of light from the hallway lamp remains visible. Watson proceeds to pour the tea, the liquid streaming from spout to cup in a gentle cascade, amber and steaming, perfectly brewed as always. He adds a small measure of milk to his own cup, the cream swirling in hypnotic patterns before settling into uniform colour, then places Holmes's cup within easy reach, prepared in the precise manner his friend prefers. Strong, no additions, hot enough to require careful sipping. "You're troubled by the absence of work," Watson observes quietly, settling back into his chair with his tea cradled in both hands, the warmth seeping through the porcelain into his palms. "I've noticed your restlessness these past 3 days." Holmes's eyes open fully now, and he reaches for his tea without comment on Watson's observation, though the slight curve of his lips acknowledges its accuracy. "The criminal classes appear to have taken a holiday," he remarks, his voice carrying that particular dry tone that indicates both amusement and genuine frustration. "London's underworld operates with uncharacteristic efficiency. Scotland Yard handles routine matters without requiring consultation, and I am left to contemplate the wallpaper's pattern until my brain atrophies from disuse. Surely not so dire as that, Watson suggests mildly, sipping his tea and savouring its warmth. The way it spreads through his chest and seems to ease the day's accumulated tensions from his muscles. You've organised your files, conducted 3 chemical experiments, the results of which I'm still not entirely certain were safe. And yesterday, you spent 5 hours at the British Museum researching that monograph you're preparing on tattoo markings among Polynesian tribes. Distractions, Holmes dismisses, though without real vehemence, his fingers wrapping around the teacup's warmth. The mind requires genuine challenge, Watson. Problems that test its capabilities and stretch its understanding. Without such stimulation, it turns inward and begins consuming itself. Much like... A sharp knock at the street door interrupts Holmes's metaphor, the sound carrying clearly up through the house, despite the rain's steady patter and the wind's increased murmuring against the windows. Both men pause, cups suspended halfway to lips, attention redirected downward toward the source of this unexpected disturbance. Another knock follows, more insistent, urgent without being frantic. The knock of someone with genuine purpose rather than casual inquiry. Holmes sets down his cup with deliberate care, his entire demeanour transforming in an instant from languid repose to focused intensity, like a hound suddenly catching an interesting scent. A late visitor, he observes, rising from his chair with fluid grace, moving toward the window that overlooks the street. Unexpected, given the hour and weather, which suggests either emergency or significant concern that outweighs discomfort and propriety. Watson joins him at the window, both men positioning themselves to observe without being clearly visible from below. Through the rain-streaked glass, illuminated by the gas lamp's glow, they can discern a figure standing before their door, a man of middle age and substantial build, wearing a long coat that glistens with accumulated moisture, his hat dripping steadily, a walking stick clutched in one gloved hand. Even from this distance, and through the distorting rain, there's something official about his bearing, something that speaks of authority and institutional position. Mrs. Hudson's voice carries up from below, muffled by distance and intervening floors, but audible enough to indicate she's answering the door, engaging in brief conversation, ascending once more toward their sitting room. Her knock comes again, and Holmes calls permission to enter before returning to his chair, though his posture now holds none of its previous relaxation. He has become the detective, all faculties engaged, ready to receive whatever problem this sodden stranger brings to their threshold. Dr. Reginald Thornbury, to see you, Mr. Holmes, Mrs. Hudson announces, slightly breathless from her repeated stair-climbing, her expression indicating this visitor invoked sufficient credentials to warrant admission despite the late hour. He says it's a matter of considerable urgency regarding the British Museum. Show him up immediately, Holmes instructs, and Watson can hear the anticipation threading through his friend's voice. The hunter recognizing potential prey, the solver of puzzles sensing an enigma worth his attention. The visitor who enters their sitting room a moment later brings with him the scent of rain and night air, of old paper and something else, something faintly medicinal or chemical that Watson's trained senses detect but cannot immediately identify. Dr. Thornbury removes his hat with one hand, revealing a high forehead and thinning grey hair. his face bearing the particular pallor of one who spends most hours indoors, away from sunlight and fresh air. His eyes, however, shine with intelligence and current distress, dark beneath thick brows, darting between Holmes and Watson with the assessment of a scholar accustomed to observing and categorizing. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he begins, his voice cultured but strained, carrying the hoarseness of someone recently under emotional pressure. "Please forgive this intrusion at such an hour. I am Dr. Reginald Thornbury, Senior Curator of Egyptian Antiquities at the British Museum. I have come on a matter that has left me quite—" He pauses, searching for the appropriate word, "disturbed, and which I believe requires your particular expertise." Holmes gestures toward the vacant chair Mrs. Hudson has quietly repositioned for their guest, his movements courteous but efficient. "Please sit, Dr. Thornbury. Mrs. Hudson, perhaps some fresh tea and a towel for our visitor. Watson, if you would assist the doctor with his coat." Within moments, their late-night caller is divested of his wet outer garments, seated before the fire with a steaming cup of tea cradled in his still trembling hands, a towel draped across his shoulders to absorb the moisture clinging to his clothing. The fire's warmth begins working its restorative magic, colour returning gradually to his cheeks, though the anxiety in his eyes remains undiminished. "Now then," Holmes begins, resuming his own seat and fixing the curator with his penetrating gaze. "Tell us what has brought you through this unpleasant weather to seek consultation at this late hour." "Something at the museum, you indicated. Some matter concerning Egyptian antiquities." Dr. Thornbury takes a long sip of his tea, as though drawing courage from its warmth, then sets the cup carefully upon his knee, both hands wrapped around it, as if seeking an anchor against the story he must relate. 3 days ago, he begins, his voice steadying as he settles into the narrative. "A most extraordinary artifact was delivered to the museum from an estate sale in Yorkshire. The late Lord Ashworth, you may be aware, was an enthusiastic amateur Egyptologist who conducted several private expeditions to the Nile region during the— Upon his death last month, his collections were bequeathed to the museum, and among the various objects was a sealed chest, a container of considerable age, bearing hieroglyphic warnings and symbols I have studied, but never previously encountered in physical form." "Warnings?" Watson interjects softly, his medical instincts already considering practical concerns. "What nature of warnings?" The curator's fingers tighten around his teacup. "Curses, Dr. Watson, though I hesitate to employ such sensational terminology. The inscriptions speak of dire consequences for those who disturb the seal, who open what was meant to remain closed, who release what was bound by ancient priesthoods for the protection of the living world. Standard tomb protection formulas, one might assume, meant to discourage thieves and grave robbers, except that the specific deity invoked is unusual, the binding described far more elaborate than typical funerary practices, and the physical seal itself bears a configuration I've never encountered in 30 years of studying Egyptian protective magic." Holmes leans forward slightly, his interest clearly engaged. "You opened this chest, I presume?" "Yesterday afternoon," Thornbury confirms, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as though the rain-wrapped walls might somehow carry his words to unwelcome listeners. "A decision I am now questioning most severely. Present during the opening were myself, my assistant curator, Mr. Benjamin Carr, and 2 museum trustees, Lord Hampton and Professor Aldridge. We followed proper archaeological protocols, documenting the seal's condition, photographing the chest from multiple angles, carefully working the ancient bronze lock until it released with mechanisms that suggested considerable sophistication for its era. He pauses, taking another sip of tea, his eyes distant now, focused upon memory rather than the comfortable sitting room surrounding him. The fire crackles gently, a log settling deeper into the grate, sending up a small shower of sparks that dance briefly before disappearing up the chimney. Outside, the rain increases its tempo slightly, drumming against the windows with renewed vigor. And somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls the half hour, 9:30. The night still young, though feeling much later within this circle of firelight and unfolding mystery. Inside the chest, Thornbury continues, his voice regaining strength, we discovered an object of extraordinary craftsmanship and unnerving design. It was a seal, or rather, the representation of a seal, carved from a single piece of black basalt in the form of a scarab beetle of unusual size, perhaps 8 inches in length, its surface covered with inscriptions in both hieroglyphic and what appears to be an older script, possibly pre-dynastic in origin. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the detail remarkable, every leg and antenna carved with microscopic precision. But the overall effect was somehow wrong, Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes. The proportions were subtly disturbing in ways I cannot adequately articulate. Looking upon it created an instinctive unease, a primitive response that preceded rational assessment. And the curse? Holmes inquires, his tone carefully neutral, betraying neither skepticism nor credulity, simply requesting information with the same interest he might show regarding any unusual detail. Manifested immediately, Thornbury says flatly, and now genuine fear threads through his voice, the fear of an educated man confronting something his rationality cannot easily dismiss. As I lifted the seal from its resting place within the chest, the temperature in the examination room dropped precipitously, so dramatically that our breath became visible in the air. Frost formed upon the windows, and several glass containers upon nearby shelves cracked from the sudden temperature change. Simultaneously, every lamp in the room flickered, dimmed almost to extinction, then blazed back with such intensity that 2 bulbs shattered. And then he hesitates, swallowing hard. Then I heard a voice, Mr. Holmes. Or rather, I felt a voice, as though someone whispered directly into my mind rather than my ears. It spoke in a language I do not know, yet somehow I understood its essential meaning. The seal is broken, the boundary breached, the guardian awakens. Watson glances at Holmes, seeing his friend's expression maintain its careful neutrality, though the detective's eyes have become intensely focused, absorbing every detail of the curator's account, filing away facts and observations for later analysis. The doctor himself feels a chill that has nothing to do with the draft from the windows, an instinctive response to hearing the supernatural invoked in such specific, personal terms. What happened then? Holmes asks quietly, his voice cutting through the rain's steady rhythm and the fire's gentle crackling. I dropped the seal, Thornbury admits, shame colouring his features. Simply lost my grip in shock, and it fell back into the chest, striking the wooden interior with a sound far heavier than its physical weight should have produced. The moment it left my hands, the temperature returned to normal, the lamps stabilized, and the voice, or sensation, ceased as abruptly as it had begun. My colleagues stood frozen, staring at me with expressions that suggested they had witnessed something profoundly disturbing, though when I inquired what they had experienced, their accounts varied significantly from my own and from each other's recollections. He sets down his teacup with a hand that still trembles slightly, then reaches into his inner jacket pocket, withdrawing a folded handkerchief which he carefully opens to reveal several sheets of paper covered with hastily sketched symbols and hieroglyphic characters. I spent the remainder of yesterday evening and most of today researching these inscriptions, he explains, offering the papers to Holmes. The basic text describes the seal as a boundary marker, a physical representation of a metaphysical barrier erected by priests of the Temple of Thoth during the reign of Pharaoh Senusret II, approximately 1880 BC. But the purpose of this barrier is described in terms I find deeply troubling. Holmes accepts the papers, angling them toward the lamplight, his eyes scanning the transcribed symbols with the rapid assessment of someone accustomed to extracting meaning from visual information. Watson rises to look over his friend's shoulder, though the hieroglyphics remain largely incomprehensible to his untrained eye, appearing as mysterious as when he first encountered them during that research visit Holmes mentioned earlier. The barrier was meant to contain something, Thornbury continues, his voice taking on the measured tone of a lecturer, falling back into familiar academic patterns, as though this provides some comfort against the inexplicable. The texts describe it as that which walks between, the consumer of boundaries, the dweller in threshold spaces. The priests feared that this entity, if indeed entity is the appropriate term, might break through the barrier, separating the realm of the living from what they termed the duat, the underworld, the place of transformation and judgment. The seal was both physical object and mystical anchor, designed to reinforce the barrier, to bind the entity in place, to prevent its crossing. And you believe, Holmes says slowly, his gaze lifting from the papers to fix upon the curator's troubled face, that by removing this seal from its chest, you have somehow compromised the barrier it was meant to maintain. Thornbury's nod comes reluctantly, as though acknowledging the absurdity, even as he cannot deny his conviction. I know how it sounds, Mr. Holmes. I am a man of science, of methodical investigation and empirical evidence. I have spent my professional life studying ancient cultures through the lens of rational analysis, treating their religious beliefs and magical practices as fascinating historical curiosities rather than living realities. And yet, something happened that your rational framework cannot adequately explain. Holmes completes the thought, his tone gentle rather than mocking, surprisingly sympathetic for someone Watson knows to be fundamentally skeptical of supernatural claims. Precisely, Thornbury whispers. And there is more, Mr. Holmes. Occurrences subsequent to the chest's opening that have transformed my academic curiosity into genuine alarm. The fire pops loudly, a burning log releasing trapped moisture, and all three men startle slightly before settling back into their positions. Watson finds himself pulling his chair marginally closer to the fire, suddenly aware of how the room's shadows seem deeper in the corners beyond the firelight's reach, how the rain against the windows sounds almost like whispering voices, how the ancient city outside these walls suddenly feels far less solid and permanent than it did mere hours ago. Last night, Thornbury continues, his voice dropping again to that near whisper that seems appropriate for relating such disturbing events. My assistant, Mr. Carr, remained late at the museum, cataloguing the other items from Lord Ashworth's collection. He was working alone in the Egyptian gallery, the building otherwise empty, save for the night watchmen making their rounds through the other wings. At approximately midnight, he reports hearing footsteps in the gallery. Not the heavy, regular tread of the guards, but something lighter, more irregular, accompanied by a sound he described as similar to sand being poured from a great height, a constant, soft, rushing whisper. Watson leans forward, his medical training asserting itself. Had Mr. Carr been working without adequate breaks? Fatigue can produce auditory hallucinations, particularly in large, echo-prone spaces like museum galleries. I suggested the same, Thornbury acknowledges, when he came to my office this morning, ashen and sleep-deprived, insisting he had encountered something impossible. But his account included specific details that give me pause, Dr. Watson. He said the footsteps moved through the gallery with apparent purpose, stopping before various display cases, pausing longest before those containing items related to funerary practices and underworld deities. He described seeing shadows where no shadows should exist, given the placement of the lamps, elongated and oddly shaped, moving independently of any physical form that might cast them. Did he observe anything directly? Holmes asks, his tone sharpening with interest. Or were these phenomena entirely peripheral, sounds and shadows without a definitive source? He claims, Thornbury says, his reluctance evident in every syllable, that when he finally gathered courage to investigate, rather than hiding in his office as common sense suggested, he found the seal, which we had secured in a locked storage cabinet following the disturbing opening ceremony, sitting atop a display case in the centre of the gallery, positioned precisely upon the case's glass surface, as though placed there with deliberate care. The storage cabinet remained locked, Mr. Holmes, its seal unbroken, the key in my possession throughout the night. Yet the artifact had somehow relocated itself from secure containment to public display. Holmes rises smoothly from his chair, moving toward his desk, where he keeps various reference materials, his fingers trailing along book spines as he searches for something specific. Objects do not move themselves, he states with quiet certainty, the fundamental principle of physical law. Therefore, either Mr. Carr's account contains errors, whether intentional fabrication, misremembering under stress, or genuine confusion, or someone with access to duplicate keys moved the seal, staging this supernatural manifestation for reasons we have not yet determined. I considered that possibility, Thornbury responds, watching Holmes's search through the books. I've examined the cabinet lock myself. No evidence of tampering. I've questioned the night watchman. No unauthorized entry recorded. No doors or windows found unsecured during their rounds. I've reviewed Mr. Carr's employment history. An exemplary junior scholar with no history of practical jokes or attention-seeking behavior. And he pauses significantly. I myself have now experienced something that defies rational explanation. This captures Holmes's full attention, causing him to abandon his book search and turn completely toward their visitor. You've had a personal encounter with these phenomena, beyond the initial incident in the examination room. This very evening, Thornbury confirms, which prompted my immediate journey here despite the hour and weather. I had remained at the museum after closing, conducting research in my private office on the 3rd floor, attempting to find some historical precedent or scholarly interpretation that might illuminate these troubling events. The sealed chest and the scarab seal were secured in a vault 2 floors below, behind locked doors and under the watchful presence of night staff. He pauses to accept the fresh cup of tea Watson has quietly poured for him, his hands trembling enough that the liquid's surface shows ripples like a disturbed pond. After taking a steadying sip, he continues. At approximately 7 o'clock this evening, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my office. That same irregular pattern Carr described, accompanied by that peculiar sound of falling sand. The footsteps approached my door, paused for perhaps 30 seconds, then continued past, fading into distance. Naturally, I opened the door immediately to observe who might be walking those corridors. But the hallway stood completely empty, lit by gas lamps whose flames were burning with unusual intensity, creating shadows that seemed somehow wrong, too dark, too solid. "You followed these phantom footsteps?" Holmes inquires, though his tone suggests he already knows the answer. "I did," Thornbury admits. Academic curiosity overcoming prudent caution, I suppose. The sound led me through corridors and down staircases, always remaining just beyond direct observation, always seeming to turn corners moments before I reached them. Eventually, I found myself in the Egyptian gallery, specifically standing before the very display case where Carr reported finding the seal the previous night. And there, Mr. Holmes. His voice catches slightly. There I saw it. Not the seal itself, but something reflected in the glass. A figure standing behind me, tall and wrapped in what appeared to be linen burial wrappings, its face obscured, yet somehow staring directly at me with an intensity I could feel, despite seeing no eyes. Watson feels his own pulse quicken, the comfortable sitting room suddenly feeling less secure, the darkness beyond the windows more present and threatening. Even Holmes's expression shows a flicker of something, not fear, certainly, but heightened interest bordering on excitement. I spun around immediately, Thornbury continues, his words coming faster now, as though urgency compels their release. But nothing stood behind me. The gallery remained empty, lit only by the few lamps left burning for the night watchman's rounds. When I looked back at the glass, the reflection had vanished, but on the floor, where the figure had appeared to stand, I found this. From his jacket pocket, he withdraws a small cloth bag, loosening its drawstring to pour a small quantity of sand onto his open palm. Sand of an unusual golden amber colour, fine-grained and somehow lustrous in the lamplight, unlike ordinary sand, but unmistakably real, tangibly present. Holmes moves swiftly to examine this evidence, producing a magnifying lens from his pocket, studying the grains with intense focus. "Egyptian sand," he murmurs after several moments of scrutiny. The colour and consistency suggest origin from the western desert region, possibly near Siwa Oasis, certainly not available from any London garden or building site. Yet sand itself proves nothing supernatural. Someone could easily have tracked this into the museum on clothing or shoes after visiting Egypt. Or it might have spilled from artifact containers. However, in context with the other events. He trails off, returning to his desk, where he locates a small glass vial, carefully transferring a sample of the sand into it before sealing it closed. "I will retain this for further analysis. Now, Dr. Thornbury, I must ask you directly, what is it you wish me to investigate? The authentication of a curse, the verification of supernatural activity, or the very earthly question who might be orchestrating an elaborate hoax designed to appear as ancient Egyptian magic? The curator meets Holmes's penetrating gaze steadily, despite his evident exhaustion and distress. I want the truth, Mr. Holmes, whatever form that truth takes. If someone is staging these events for purposes of fraud, blackmail, or simply malicious mischief, I want them identified and stopped before the museum's reputation suffers damage, or staff members are genuinely harmed. But if, and I acknowledge this sounds absurd spoken aloud in this rational modern setting, but if there exists some genuine supernatural danger associated with this artifact, some ancient power we have inadvertently activated, I want to know how to contain it, how to restore whatever barrier we may have compromised, how to protect innocent people from consequences they cannot possibly understand or defend against. Holmes stands in thoughtful silence for several moments, his fingers steepled before his face in that characteristic gesture, his eyes half closed as he processes information and calculates approaches. The rain continues its steady rhythm against the windows. The fire burns low in the grate. Needing attention, Watson realizes he should provide, but finds himself reluctant to break this tableau of concentration and revelation. Finally, Holmes speaks, his decision made. Watson and I will visit the museum tomorrow morning, examine this seal and its chest, interview your Mr. Carr and any other witnesses, inspect the locations where these phenomena occurred. I make no promises regarding the nature of my conclusions. I will follow evidence wherever it leads, whether toward human agency or... He pauses delicately. Less conventional explanations. I ask only your complete cooperation, unrestricted access to the relevant artifacts and locations, and the freedom to pursue investigation according to my methods without institutional interference. Relief floods Thornbury's features, years seeming to drop from his face as the burden of solitary responsibility lifts. You have my complete cooperation, Mr. Holmes, and I will ensure that all relevant personnel and resources are made available to you. I can meet you at the museum at whatever hour you prefer. Shall we say 10 o'clock? To allow for morning rounds, but ensure privacy before public visiting hours. 10 o'clock will be suitable, Holmes confirms, extending his hand to seal the agreement. In the meantime, I recommend you return home, eat a proper meal if you haven't already, and attempt to secure some rest. Fatigue clouds judgment and perception, and we will need your scholarly expertise functioning at full capacity. Thornbury rises, shaking Holmes's hand firmly, then Watson's, gratitude evident in his grip and expression. Thank you, gentlemen. You cannot know what relief I feel, having shared this burden and secured your assistance. I confess I had feared you might dismiss my concerns as the fantasies of an overwrought academic, or worse, refuse involvement with something so apparently irrational. The universe contains more mysteries than any single mind can encompass. Holmes replies quietly, his tone philosophical rather than dismissive. What we call supernatural often proves merely natural phenomena we do not yet understand, and even genuine impossibilities deserve investigation, if only to confirm their impossibility with proper rigor. Mrs. Hudson materializes in response to the bell Holmes rings, helping their visitor back into his still damp coat, fussing over him with that maternal efficiency she employs so effectively. Within moments, Doctor. Thornbury has departed, his footsteps receding down the stairs, the street door opening and closing, the rain presumably swallowing him into the night's darkness as he makes his way home, or perhaps to hail a hansom cab if one can be found in such weather. Holmes immediately returns to his chair, his entire body language transformed from the languid boredom of earlier evening to focused intensity. He retrieves Thornbury's papers, spreading them across his lap, studying the hieroglyphic transcriptions with the concentrated attention of a scholar deciphering a critical text. Watson tends the fire, adding fresh coal from the scuttle, stirring the embers to life, coaxing new flames that push back the shadows and restore warmth to the room's atmosphere. You're actually considering the possibility that this curse might be genuine, Watson observes, not quite making it a question, settling back into his chair with fresh tea that has grown lukewarm but remains drinkable. I am considering all possibilities, Holmes corrects, not looking up from his scrutiny of the papers. Thornbury's account contains elements that suggest elaborate staging, the convenient timing, the classical supernatural manifestations, the physical evidence that proves little while seeming to prove much. Yet, it also contains elements that trouble me, Watson, details that don't align with typical fraud patterns, the psychological specificity of the experiences, the variation in phenomena observed by different witnesses, the curator's evident sincerity and professional risk he accepts by involving us in what could easily become scandal if publicized incorrectly. He sets aside the papers, reaching instead for his pipe, filling it with tobacco from the Persian slipper, tamping the leaves with practiced efficiency. The match flares bright in the dimness, and soon fragrant smoke begins spiraling upward, adding its distinctive scent to the room's complex aromatic tapestry. I am reminded, Holmes continues, his voice taking on a reflective quality, of a case in my early career before you chronicled my adventures, Watson. A wealthy collector reported that objects in his private museum were rearranging themselves, that ancient swords moved from their displays, that medieval armor appeared in different rooms each morning despite locked doors and faithful servants. What did you discover? Watson asks, genuinely curious, always eager for these glimpses into his friend's pre-documented cases. That the collector himself was suffering from early-stage cognitive decline, a progressive condition that caused him to move objects during episodes of confusion, then forget his actions entirely, attributing the changes to supernatural intervention rather than acknowledging his deteriorating faculties. A sad case, ultimately, but entirely explicable through medical rather than mystical frameworks. Holmes draws deeply on his pipe, exhaling smoke that catches the firelight. However, I also recall a case in Prague, approximately 5 years ago, where phenomena initially appearing supernatural proved to involve forces not precisely natural in the conventional sense, a confluence of psychological manipulation, environmental factors, and what I can only term resonant emotional energies, that seemed to produce measurable physical effects through mechanisms I still do not fully understand. Watson feels his skepticism warring with the respect he holds for Holmes's judgment. You're suggesting that curses might operate through some psychological mechanism. That belief itself creates tangible effects. I'm suggesting, Holmes replies carefully, that we understand far less about consciousness and its interaction with physical reality than we often assume. The mind can produce measurable physiological changes through belief alone. Your medical training confirms this, surely. A patient convinced they're ill can manifest genuine symptoms, while one convinced of recovery may heal faster than purely physical factors predict. Why should we assume these effects remain strictly bounded within the believer's body? Might not sufficiently intense conviction, especially conviction accumulated over centuries and invested in physical objects by countless believers, create something approaching objective reality? It's a disturbing thought, one that unsettles Watson's comfortable materialistic worldview, suggesting that reality might be more fluid, more responsive to consciousness than Victorian science prefers to acknowledge. He finds himself staring into the fire, watching flames consume coal, transforming solid matter into heat and light and ash. Transformation being itself a kind of magic, he supposes, even when explicable through chemistry and physics. In any case, Holmes concludes, setting aside his pipe, tomorrow will provide opportunities for direct observation and evidence gathering. I suggest we both retire early tonight, Watson. Museums have a peculiar atmosphere, particularly their storage areas and closed galleries, places where dust accumulates in corners, where light filters strangely through high windows, where the presence of so many artifacts from vanished civilizations creates an almost palpable weight of history. We must approach with rested minds and sharp senses, prepared for both rational investigation and... He pauses, selecting words carefully. Unexpected developments. Watson nods agreement, suddenly aware of how thoroughly the evening's events have displaced his earlier relaxed drowsiness. His mind feels alert now, turning over the curator's account, trying to construct frameworks that might encompass walking mummies and impossible transport of sealed artifacts alongside rational explanation and natural law. The rain outside has diminished to a soft drizzle. The wind dropped to gentle whispers around the building's eaves, and London settles into the deeper silence of night's middle hours. Before we retire, Watson says, a thought occurring. Shouldn't we research this Lord Ashworth? If his collections contained this troublesome seal, perhaps his papers include documentation about where and how he acquired it, whether previous owners reported similar phenomena. He scans the clipping quickly, his eyes moving with that characteristic rapidity of a mind processing information far faster than ordinary reading permits. His Egyptian expeditions occurred between 1863 and 1867, primarily focused on Middle Kingdom sites in the Fayum region. No major discoveries attributed to him, but he accumulated substantial collections of what the notice terms lesser artifacts of considerable scholarly interest. Holmes sets aside the obituary, retrieving a second clipping. And here, more intriguing, a brief mention from 1868, a letter published in the Archaeological Review where Ashworth describes discovering what he terms an intact priestly cache in a collapsed tomb near the Lahun pyramid. He mentions difficulties during excavation, local workers refusing to continue after the cache was exposed, claiming the site was protected by unusual bindings. Ashworth dismissed these concerns as superstition, completed the excavation with European assistance, and shipped the materials to England for private study. The cache that contained the sealed chest, Watson speculates. Almost certainly, Holmes agrees, which suggests our artifact has remained sealed since approximately 1868, during which time Ashworth apparently experienced no reported difficulties, though absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. as we well know. We should inquire whether his daughter observed anything unusual in her father's later years, whether his death held any suspicious circumstances, whether household staff reported phenomena similar to what now occurs at the museum. Watson suppresses a yawn, his body reasserting its desire for sleep, despite his mind's continued engagement with the mystery. Tomorrow promises to be quite extraordinary, he observes, rising from his chair, feeling the stiffness in his leg, where an old war wound sometimes reminds him of campaigns in distant lands, of heat and dust and dangers very different from cursed artifacts in London museums. Tomorrow, Holmes echoes, his expression unreadable in the firelight and shadows. We shall seek truth among ancient stones and modern fears, rational explanations and impossible manifestations. Sleep well, Watson. We may require all our faculties before this investigation concludes. They separate to their respective bedrooms, Watson pausing at his door to look back at the sitting room, now dimmed and quiet, the fire burning low, the rain resuming its gentle whisper against the windows. He cannot entirely shake the image Thornbury painted, that reflected figure wrapped in burial linens, standing silent and somehow watching despite having no visible eyes. It's the sort of image that lodges in imagination, emerging later in dreams, or in those uncertain moments between waking and sleep, when the rational mind relaxes its guard and older, more primitive instincts resurface. His bedroom feels welcoming despite, or perhaps because of, the evening's unsettling revelations, the familiar space offering comfort through its very ordinariness. The bed with its warm blankets, the nightstand with its lamp and pocket watch, the window looking out onto rain-soaked Baker Street, where gas lamps create pools of amber light in the darkness. Watson changes into his nightshirt, performs his evening ablutions, then settles into bed with the pleasant anticipation of someone about to drift into well-earned rest. Sleep comes gradually, approaching like an incoming tide, consciousness ebbing as the day's accumulated sensory impressions replay in fragmentary form. Thornbury's worried face, Holmes's interested expression, the vial of golden sand, hieroglyphics whose meanings remain mysterious, the sound of rain that continues throughout the night like a lullaby older than human civilization, speaking of cycles and seasons, of water returning to earth, of boundaries between sky and ground made permeable and flowing. Watson dreams of deserts he has never visited, of sand dunes stretching under stars brighter than London ever reveals, of structures carved from living rock, of passages descending into darkness where something ancient waltzes with patience that transcends human understanding of time. He dreams of seals and boundaries, of lines drawn in sand and stone, of guardians positioned at thresholds between what is permitted and what must remain forever separated. The dreams feel somehow not entirely his own, as though his sleeping mind has touched something existing independently, some current or frequency always present, but usually undetected beneath waking consciousness's dominating chatter. He wakes several times during the night, each time briefly disoriented, feeling as though he has travelled vast distances, and returned finding his bedroom strange and unfamiliar for several heartbeats before recognition reasserts itself. Through his window, he observes the rain continuing its patient work, washing the city, filling gutters and drains, seeping into earth and stone, the ancient cycle that predates London's streets and will continue long after they crumble back to their constituent elements. Morning arrives grey and damp, the rain reduced to occasional drizzle, clouds hanging low over rooftops like tattered wool, diffusing what little daylight penetrates their thickness. Watson rises, feeling somewhat unrested, despite adequate hours of sleep, as though the night's dreams occupied energy rather than restoring it. He dresses in practical clothing, suitable for museum exploration, choosing sturdy shoes and a warm waistcoat. Then descends to find Holmes already breakfasting, surrounded by books and papers that suggest he spent at least some of the night in continued research. "Good morning, Watson," Holmes greets him, looking surprisingly fresh despite the paper's volume suggesting limited sleep. "Mrs. Hudson has prepared excellent kippers this morning, and I recommend the coffee. I've requested she make it particularly strong, anticipating we'll need mental clarity for the day's endeavours." Watson serves himself from the sideboard, the breakfast's hearty aromas, fish and toast, and coffee's bitter richness, helping anchor him back in the ordinary world of physical sustenance and daily routines. He notices Holmes has acquired additional materials since last night, including what appears to be a scholarly text on Egyptian funerary practices and several maps of the Fayum region. "Productive night?" Watson inquires, settling into his place at the table. His first sip of coffee, indeed, strong enough to clear residual sleep fogginess from his mind. "Illuminating," Holmes replies, pushing aside his empty plate, focusing entirely on a particular book lying open before him. "I've been researching the deity specifically mentioned in Thornbury's transcriptions, Anubis in his aspect as guardian of thresholds, the jackal-headed god who walks boundaries between life and death, between order and chaos, between the sanctioned and the forbidden. Most familiar sources treat Anubis primarily as a psychopomp, a guide conducting souls through the underworld's geography. But older texts, particularly those from Middle Kingdom period, when our seal was created, attribute to him a more active protective function. He rotates the book so Watson can see the page, which features an illustration of the traditional jackal-headed figure, but rendered in a style that emphasizes predatory vigilance rather than benevolent guidance. These earlier traditions describe Anubis as a boundary keeper, one who enforces separations between realms, who ensures that what belongs to death remains contained within death's proper territory, that the living world is protected from incursions by entities or forces meant to remain beyond the veil. Watson studies the illustration while eating his breakfast, noting how the artist captured something unsettling in the deity's posture, a tension suggesting coiled readiness to respond to boundary violations. And the seal Thornbury discovered represents or invokes this protective function. Precisely, Holmes confirms. The inscriptions describe it as an anchor point, a physical manifestation of Anubis's watchfulness, positioned to reinforce a specific weak point in the metaphysical boundary. Though, of course, these are my interpretations of symbolic language, Watson. The actual texts speak in terms of binding the wanderer, strengthening the threshold where the wanderer paces seeking passage, maintaining eternal vigilance against the one who dwells between. This wanderer being the entity the seal was meant to contain? Watson asks, his appetite suddenly diminished, the kippers tasting somehow less appealing as he contemplates ancient forces straining against barriers erected millennia ago. So, the texts suggest, Holmes acknowledges, closing the book and rising from the table. Though whether this represents genuine metaphysical reality or merely the religious cosmology through which an ancient culture interpreted natural phenomena remains to be determined. In precisely 90 minutes, we will begin gathering empirical data, examining physical evidence, and hopefully establishing whether we face elaborate human deception or something rather more unusual. They complete their breakfast in companionable silence, each man absorbed in private thoughts, preparation for the day's investigation. Watson finds his gaze drawn repeatedly to the window, watching London wake despite the gloomy weather, tradesmen making deliveries, clerks hurrying to offices, street sweepers clearing yesterday's accumulated refuse, the vast machinery of the modern city grinding forward with the inexorable momentum that seems to define Victorian progress and expansion. Yet, beneath this surface of industrial civilization and scientific advancement, Watson cannot help contemplating the layers London conceals, the Roman ruins beneath medieval foundations, the rivers flowing through culverts underground, the plague pits and ancient burials over which contemporary streets pass unknowing, the accumulated history of millennia compressed beneath modern pavement, and now, gathered into museums and private collections, artifacts from civilizations even older than Rome, objects imbued with beliefs and purposes that contemporary rationalism categorizes as superstition, but perhaps does not fully understand. The clock chimes 9, its mechanism marking time with Victorian precision, and Holmes announces their departure imminent. They gather necessary items: Holmes's magnifying lens, his measuring tape, his notebook and pencils, the vial containing last night's sand sample for comparison purposes. Watson ensures he has his medical bag, uncertain whether physical injuries might require attention, but trained to automatic preparation. Mrs. Hudson provides their coats, dried now from yesterday's soaking, and gloves against the morning's chill. The cab ride to the British Museum passes through streets still wet from night's rain, the horses' hooves splashing through puddles, wheels hissing against slick pavement. The city looks washed and somehow subdued in the grey morning light, colours muted, edges softened, as though the rain has dissolved some of reality's usual sharpness. They pass through neighbourhoods, transitioning from residential to institutional, the architecture becoming progressively more grand and formal as they approach Bloomsbury, the area where Victorian London houses its accumulated knowledge and cultural treasures. The British Museum rises before them like a Greco-Roman temple transplanted to modern England, its massive columns and broad steps speaking of imperial ambitions and scholarly aspirations, of empire's determination to gather, catalogue, and contain the world's knowledge and artefacts under British stewardship. Even in the grey morning light, the building possesses undeniable majesty, though Watson finds himself wondering what the ancient Egyptians might think, seeing their sacred objects displayed behind glass for tourists and schoolchildren to gawk at, their holy mysteries reduced to educational exhibits and archaeological curiosities. Dr. Thornbury awaits them inside the entrance, looking somewhat recovered from last night's distress, though still bearing signs of insufficient sleep and continued worry. He's dressed in formal professional attire, his role as senior curator evident in his bearing, despite the anxiety lingering in his eyes. With him stands a younger man, perhaps 30 years of age, with the slender build and intellectual intensity of someone more comfortable with books and artifacts than physical labour. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Thornbury greets them with evident relief. Thank you for your punctuality. May I introduce my assistant curator, Mr. Benjamin Carr, who experienced the phenomena I described last evening. Carr, these are the gentlemen who will be investigating our situation. Carr extends his hand for shaking, his grip firm, though Watson notes a slight tremor, whether from caffeine consumption or residual nervousness, difficult to determine. Gentlemen, he says, his voice cultured but carrying an underlying tension. I confess I feel simultaneously foolish and profoundly unsettled discussing these events in daylight, in this temple of rational scholarship. Yet I cannot dismiss what I observed, cannot construct any explanation that adequately encompasses the evidence without reaching toward conclusions I would have dismissed as medieval superstition mere days ago. Then let us examine that evidence systematically, Holmes suggests, his tone reassuring yet businesslike. I understand the seal remains secured in your vault facility. I should like to begin there, observing the artifact itself and the container from which it was removed. Thornbury nods, gesturing toward a side corridor that leads away from the public galleries toward the museum's extensive behind-the-scenes areas. Storage vaults, conservation laboratories, curatorial offices, the infrastructure supporting the institution's public face. They proceed through increasingly restricted areas, passing locked doors that Thornbury opens with keys selected from a substantial ring, descending stairs that take them below ground level, where temperature and humidity can be more precisely controlled for artifact preservation. The vault level possesses an atmosphere distinct from the galleries above, cooler, drier, silent, except for the whisper of ventilation systems, lit by electric bulbs that cast harsh illumination, devoid of the natural light's gentleness. Steel shelving extends into dimness, holding countless objects wrapped in preservation materials, tagged and catalogued, waiting their turn for display or study. It's a repository of history reduced to inventory, Watson thinks, though no less fascinating for that reduction. They reach a reinforced door with particularly substantial locks, which Thornbury opens with evident care, revealing a smaller chamber within, the high-security vault reserved for the most valuable or sensitive materials. Inside, on a steel table positioned beneath particularly bright lighting, sits a wooden chest of obvious antiquity, its surface dark with age, perhaps 2 feet long and half that in width and depth, its corners reinforced with bronze fittings, green with patina. Beside the chest, positioned on a separate tray, lined with preservation cloth, rests the scarab seal itself, and Watson feels his breath catch slightly upon seeing it directly. The object possesses an undeniable presence that transcends its physical properties. Black basalt, carved with extraordinary skill into the form of a scarab perhaps 8 inches long, as Thornbury indicated, its surface covered with hieroglyphics and other symbols that seem to catch the light in unusual ways, creating shifting patterns that suggest movement where none should exist. Holmes approaches slowly, his movements deliberate and careful, observing the seal from multiple angles before making physical contact. Watson watches his friend's face, seeing the intense concentration, the slight narrowing of eyes that indicates Holmes's formidable analytical faculties fully engaged. The detective produces his magnifying lens, examining the seal's surface in minute detail, occasionally leaning close enough that his breath must disturb any loose dust particles, though the artifact appears to have been carefully cleaned. The craftsmanship is indeed extraordinary, Holmes murmurs, his voice slightly abstracted. attention primarily on the object before him. The hieroglyphics are deeply incised, filled with what appears to be gold leaf in some places, silver in others, creating deliberate contrast and emphasis. The older script you mentioned, Thornbury, appears here along the ventral surface, pre-dynastic, you suggested. I'm not sufficiently expert to confirm, but the style is certainly distinct from the standard hieroglyphics. The basalt itself is unusually dense, remarkably cold to touch, even accounting for the vault's temperature control. He straightens, turning attention to the chest, examining its exterior surfaces with equal care. The original seal mechanism here on the lid, bronze lock, quite sophisticated for its era, now opened, but showing minimal damage from the unlocking process. Well done on the conservation front, though of course we don't yet know whether opening it was wise. The wood appears to be cedar, common for Egyptian storage purposes. The bronze fittings consistent with Middle Kingdom metalworking techniques. The external inscriptions. He leans closer. Yes, warnings as you indicated. Let no hand disturb this binding. Let the seal remain unbroken, lest the threshold fail. Bound by the will of the temple, by the authority of the throne, by the power of the guardian. Holmes straightens again, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. From a purely archaeological perspective, an entirely legitimate artifact, its age and provenance appearing authentic subject to more rigorous analysis. Now, Thornbury, walk me through exactly what occurred when you opened the chest. Precise details, please. Who stood where? Who touched what? The sequence of events leading to the phenomena you described. Thornbury positions himself as he stood during the opening, gesturing to indicate where his colleagues were stationed, describing the photographic documentation process, the careful manipulation of the ancient lock, the moment the lid lifted, revealing the seal resting within a nest of decayed linen wrappings. His account matches the previous night's version in all significant details, though Watson notes him watching Holmes's face anxiously, clearly hoping the detective will discover some overlooked natural explanation that renders the supernatural interpretation unnecessary. And when you lifted the seal, Holmes prompts, you noted temperature drop, lamp disturbances, and an auditory or psychological phenomenon you interpreted as a voice. Did your colleagues report similar experiences? Lord Hampton reported the temperature change and lamp flickering, Thornbury confirms, but not the voice. Professor Aldridge claimed to have seen nothing unusual whatsoever, suggesting we experienced shared hallucination from excitement and poor ventilation. Carr reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and presence, as though something invisible but malevolent had entered the room. But he neither heard voices nor observed any physical phenomena, beyond noting the rest of us looked distressed. Interesting, Holmes muses, circling the table, examining the scene from multiple perspectives. Varied subjective experiences suggesting either staged effects targeting specific individuals or psychological phenomena triggered by belief and suggestion rather than objective physical causes. Yet the temperature change and lamp behavior represent potentially measurable physical effects, not merely subjective interpretations. Were thermometers present? Any instrumental recording? No, Thornbury admits. The opening occurred in an examination room equipped for photography and visual documentation, but not environmental monitoring. In retrospect, an unfortunate oversight, though we had no reason to anticipate unusual physical phenomena accompanying what we presumed would be a routine archaeological procedure. Holmes nods, accepting this, then carefully, almost reverently, reaches toward the seal, his fingers hovering above its surface for a moment before making contact. Watson finds himself unconsciously holding his breath, half expecting some dramatic manifestation, but nothing obvious occurs. Holmes lifts the seal from its tray, testing its weight, examining the underside, holding it near his ear and tapping it lightly, as though listening for some internal quality. Remarkably dense, Holmes comments. The weight seems excessive for basalt, though I'm not sufficiently familiar with this specific stone's properties to judge whether that falls within normal parameters. No obvious hollows or compartments that might contain mechanisms for producing the effects you describe. The surface temperature does feel unusually cold, though, again, that might simply reflect thermal properties of dense stone stored in controlled environment. He returns the seal carefully to its position, then shifts attention to the chest's interior, examining the remaining linen fragments, running his fingers along the cedar wood, measuring the interior dimensions. These linen wrappings, have they been analysed? Age, composition, any residual substances that might have interacted with the artifacts during long containment. Preliminary analysis suggests linen consistent with 12th Dynasty textiles, Carr responds, speaking for the first time since they entered the vault, his voice steadier now, focused on scholarly details rather than supernatural fears. Traces of natron, plant resins, and what appear to be essential oils consistent with preservation techniques documented from the period. Nothing unexpected or anomalous from a materials perspective, though full spectroscopic analysis has not yet been completed. Holmes produces a small envelope from his pocket, using tweezers to collect minute samples of the linen fragments, sealing them carefully. I'll conduct my own analysis, if you don't object. Now, regarding the seal's reported relocation from this vault to the public gallery. Carr, describe precisely what you observed upon finding it outside its secured containment. The younger curator visibly steels himself, clearly uncomfortable revisiting the experience, but committed to providing accurate testimony. I was working in my office on the 3rd floor, cataloguing documentation from Lord Ashworth's papers. At approximately midnight, I heard sounds from the Egyptian gallery below, footsteps, as I mentioned, and that peculiar rushing whisper, like sand being poured. Initially, I dismissed it as imagination, or the night watchman making rounds, but the sounds continued with such persistence that I felt compelled to investigate. He pauses, collecting his thoughts, and Thornbury places a supportive hand on his assistant's shoulder. I descended to the gallery level, Carr continues, finding the corridor lights burning normally, no signs of intrusion or disturbance. The gallery doors stood as I had left them, closed but not locked since night staff require access during their rounds. I entered the gallery intending to quickly verify nothing was amiss and return to my work. What time precisely did you enter the gallery? Holmes asks, his tone gentle but insistent on specificity. Shortly after midnight, perhaps 5 past, no later than 10 past, Carr responds. The gallery appeared normal initially, all display cases in their proper positions, nothing obviously disturbed. But I noticed the footstep sounds had ceased upon my entry, replaced by complete silence that felt somehow expectant, as though something was holding its breath, waiting. Then I saw the shadows. Describe them, Holmes instructs, moving to stand beside Carr, his posture subtly supportive, encouraging continued narration. They were cast upon the walls and floor, Carr explains, his words coming slowly, chosen carefully, but they possessed wrong angles, wrong shapes for the lamp positions that should have produced them. One in particular, behind the center display case, suggested a human figure standing upright, but elongated and somehow doubled, as though the shadow itself possessed a shadow. As I watched, it moved, not smoothly, but in a stuttering fashion, shifting position instantaneously, rather than flowing continuously, appearing first on one wall, then suddenly on another, without traversing the space between. Watson sees Holmes's eyes narrow in concentration, filing away these details, clearly constructing some mental framework to encompass or explain them. And the seal itself? The detective prompts. Positioned atop the center display case, Carr confirms. Exactly as I described to Dr. Thornbury, sitting directly on the glass surface, aligned with perfect precision to the case's center, positioned with deliberate care that suggested intentional placement rather than random discard. The case beneath it contains funerary equipment, canopic jars, amulets, a fragment of a Book of the Dead papyrus, all items related to death transition, death preparation, death protection. Did you touch the seal? Attempt to move it? Holmes asks. Carr shakes his head firmly. I immediately retreated, secured myself in my office, and waited until morning when I could report to Dr. Thornbury. I confess I lacked the courage to approach it directly, alone in that dark gallery with those impossible shadows moving on the walls. Perhaps I failed some test of rationalism and courage, but my instincts screamed warnings I felt compelled to heed. Entirely understandable and possibly prudent, Holmes assures him, then turns to Thornbury. And you verified the vault locks had not been compromised. No duplicate keys unaccounted for. No staff with both motive and means to stage this relocation. I conducted thorough investigation, Thornbury confirms. The vault locks showed no tampering signs. Key accountability is rigorous. Only myself and one senior conservator possess vault access, and she was verifiably at home with her family throughout the relevant period. The night watchmen have no vault access and reported nothing unusual during their rounds. I examined the seal upon finding it in the gallery and detected no obvious signs of handling, no fingerprints, no transferred oils or residues, nothing suggesting human contact. Holmes stands in contemplative silence for several moments, his gaze moving between the seal, the chest, and the two curators who have shared their unsettling accounts. Finally he speaks, his voice measured and thoughtful. I see several possible explanations, each with varying degrees of probability, but none entirely satisfying. First, human agency, employing methods and access we have not yet discovered. Duplicate keys obtained through impression, co-conspirators among staff, staged phenomena designed to appear supernatural for purposes we don't yet understand. Second, misperception and confabulation, genuine anomalies interpreted through supernatural frameworks, details unconsciously elaborated or distorted through retelling, false memories created through suggestion and anxiety. Third, he pauses, seeming to carefully consider his phrasing, something rather more unusual that requires frameworks beyond conventional materialism. You're suggesting the curse might actually be operative? Thornbury asks, his tone hovering between hope for for scientific validation and fear of confirmation. "I'm suggesting," Holmes replies carefully, "that I've encountered sufficient unexplained phenomena in my career to maintain cautious agnosticism regarding the boundaries of natural law. The seal represents a fascinating artifact, regardless of supernatural considerations. The question is whether its mystery remains purely historical and archaeological, or whether it has somehow become actively engaged with present circumstances." He turns toward the vault door, clearly ready to proceed to the next phase of investigation. "I should like to examine the gallery where Carr encountered the relocated seal. Then interview the night watchmen who were on duty. Then review Lord Ashworth's papers regarding the seal's discovery and any observations he recorded prior to his death. We shall accumulate data methodically, construct hypotheses, test them against evidence, and hopefully arrive at conclusions satisfying to both reason and observed facts." They exit the vault, Thornbury carefully securing the reinforced door behind them, the seal and chest returning to their isolated containment. As they ascend back toward ground level, Watson finds himself relieved to be leaving that cold, silent space, grateful to return to areas inhabited by living people and natural light, even the grey London daylight filtering through the museum's high windows. There's something oppressive about those underground vaults, he thinks, something that weighs upon the spirit independent of any cursed artifacts or supernatural considerations. Simply the accumulated presence of so many objects, removed from their original contexts, displaced in time and space, gathered here in sterile preservation, while their creators and original owners have long since crumbled to dust. The Egyptian gallery occupies the museum's ground floor, a vast room with soaring ceilings and rows of glass display cases containing artifacts arranged by period and function. Daily life objects here, religious items there, funerary equipment in the center section, where Carr reported his disturbing encounter. Morning light filters through high windows, transformed by the glass panes into diffused illumination that renders the gallery somehow dreamlike, existing in that peculiar state between full daylight and shadow that museums often inhabit. The space stands empty at this early hour, public visitors not yet admitted, only a few staff members, visible in distant sections, conducting morning routines. The silence feels different from the vault's oppressive quiet. This is the silence of vast space and stone surfaces, sound-absorbing and contemplative rather than constricting. Their footsteps echo softly as they walk toward the center of the gallery, where the funerary display cases stand in parallel rows. This case, Carr indicates, stopping before a waist-high display containing the items he mentioned. 4 canopic jars with their distinctive carved lids representing the 4 sons of Horus, several amulets of gold and faience, and indeed a papyrus fragment covered with hieroglyphics and small illustrations, showing the deceased's journey through the underworld trials. The seal was positioned exactly here, centered on the glass surface with precision suggesting deliberate placement. Holmes produces his magnifying lens, examining the case's glass surface with minute attention, searching presumably for traces that might indicate how the seal was positioned. Fingerprints, residue, anything suggesting human handling. Watson watches his friend's systematic search, the patient movement of the lens across every inch of the relevant surface. Holmes's expression intent, but revealing nothing of whether he's finding significant evidence or frustrating absence thereof. No obvious prints, Holmes eventually concludes. Though the glass has been recently cleaned, I can detect traces of the cleaning solution along the edges. Were you aware the case had been cleaned, Thornbury? The curator frowns thoughtfully. Morning staff routinely clean display cases before public hours, removing fingerprints left by previous day's visitors. The gallery would have been cleaned yesterday morning, several hours before Carr's nighttime encounter. Then cleaned again this morning before your arrival. Any traces from the seal's positioning would likely have been removed by this morning's routine maintenance. Unfortunate, but understandable. Holmes accepts, shifting his attention to the floor surrounding the case, examining the tile surface from multiple angles, occasionally dropping to hands and knees to observe from nearly ground level. Watson recognizes this methodology from countless previous investigations. Holmes's ability to detect minute traces others overlook, his trained eye perceiving significance in disturbances most would dismiss as random marks or meaningless wear patterns. Here, Holmes says quietly, producing a small brush and paper envelope from his pocket, carefully collecting something from the floor near the case's base. Sand, identical in colour and texture to what Thornbury found in the gallery yesterday evening. A small trail of it, perhaps a dozen grains, leading from this case toward the corridor exit, as though something carrying residual sand on its person or form passed this way, leaving this subtle trail. He continues following this nearly invisible path, occasionally pausing to collect additional samples, documenting the trail's direction with sketched notations in his notebook. The trail leads them out of the gallery, down a side corridor, toward a service stairwell that provides staff access between floors. The sand grains become sparser, more scattered, eventually disappearing entirely at the stairwell's base. So either, Holmes muses, straightening from his examination, someone deliberately scattered this sand to create the impression of a supernatural entity passing this way, or something genuinely did pass this way, leaving traces we can physically detect even if the source remains mysterious. The deliberate scattering hypothesis suggests elaborate planning and intimate knowledge of Egyptian archaeological materials, plus opportunity to access the gallery during night hours without detection, which would narrow suspects substantially, Thornbury notes, his tone almost hopeful, clearly preferring human conspiracy to supernatural activity, despite the discomfort either option presents. Only senior curatorial staff possess such knowledge and access, and I cannot imagine any of them orchestrating something so bizarre and potentially damaging to the institution's reputation. Cannot imagine is not the same as impossible, Holmes observes, not unkindly. People act from motives that often surprise those who believe they know them well. However, I agree, the deliberate staging hypothesis faces significant challenges. The effort required seems disproportionate to any obvious benefit, and the risk of discovery would be substantial. Let us continue gathering information before constructing premature theories. They proceed to interview the night watchmen, finding them in the staff area, completing their shift paperwork before departing for home and well-earned rest. The three men, all former military, Watson notes from their bearing, the sort of steady, reliable personnel museums favour for security positions, provide consistent accounts of their rounds during the night in question. They observed nothing unusual, heard no disturbances, found all public areas secure when they conducted their scheduled inspections of each gallery at hourly intervals throughout the night. You entered the Egyptian gallery during your rounds. Holmes asks the watchman responsible for that section, a grizzled former sergeant named Matthews, with the weathered face of someone who spent years on foreign campaigns before returning to quieter civilian employment. "Every hour on the hour, sir," Matthews confirms, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who follows procedures with military precision. Entered from the main doorway, walked completely through the gallery, checking each row of cases, exited through the side corridor. Nothing disturbed, no persons present, all cases properly secured. Completed my midnight round at precisely 12:03, according to my log. "And you observed Mr. Carr in his office during this round?" Holmes inquires. Matthews shakes his head. "Saw his lights burning on the 3rd floor from the courtyard during my exterior circuit, but didn't encounter him directly. He often works late when cataloguing new acquisitions. Nothing unusual about his presence." "Did you return to the Egyptian gallery after midnight?" Holmes continues. "Not until my 1 o'clock round." Matthews replies, "Completed that inspection at 1:04, again finding everything properly secured. No disturbances noted in my log." Yet Carr reported entering the gallery shortly after midnight and finding the seal positioned on the display case, Watson thinks, which suggests either Carr's timeline is incorrect, or Matthews somehow missed seeing the seal during his midnight inspection, or the seal was placed after Matthews completed his round, but before Carr's investigation, a window of perhaps 15 to 20 minutes. Any of these possibilities raises additional questions rather than providing clear answers. Holmes thanks the watchman, allows them to depart, then turns to Thornbury with an expression of focused intensity. "I should like to review Lord Ashworth's papers now, particularly any documentation regarding the discovery of the sealed chest, and any personal observations he recorded about the artifact or experiences subsequent to acquiring it." Thornbury leads them to a storage room on the museum's 3rd floor, where Ashworth's donated materials await processing. Wooden crates and leather cases containing journals, correspondence, sketches, and photographic documentation from his Egyptian expeditions. The room smells of old paper, leather, and dust, that particular scent of historical archives that Watson finds simultaneously appealing and slightly melancholy, each page representing moments and observations from a life now concluded. They spread out around a large work table, Thornbury and Carr assisting by unpacking relevant materials, while Holmes begins his systematic review. Watson finds himself assigned a stack of correspondence, looking for any mentions of unusual occurrences or difficulties following Ashworth's acquisition of the chest. The letters prove largely mundane, discussions of shipping arrangements, authentication requests to various scholars, social invitations and responses, the ordinary documentary residue of a wealthy man's active social and intellectual life. Hours pass in absorbed research, the work's rhythm creating its own kind of meditative focus, the outside world receding as they immerse themselves in Ashworth's documented experiences. Occasionally, someone breaks the silence to share a potentially relevant passage, but mostly they work in quiet concentration, turning pages carefully, reading by the natural light supplemented by work lamps positioned to minimize eye strain. Watson's attention catches on a letter dated November 1868, written by Ashworth to a colleague and describing his return to England following his final Egyptian expedition. "Listen to this," Watson says, reading aloud. I have brought home several items of considerable interest, including a sealed chest my local workers absolutely refused to approach after we exposed it within the collapsed tomb. Their superstitious terror proved so extreme that I was forced to extract the chest myself, with only my European assistance, the Egyptians having fled the site, claiming the place was protected by Anubis himself, and that we had violated a holy binding. Nonsense, of course, though I confess the chest gives me peculiar sensations when I handle it. A coldness that seems to penetrate beyond physical temperature. And sometimes late at night, I fancy I hear something moving about my study, though nothing is ever disturbed when I investigate. Age and imagination playing tricks, no doubt, though I find myself oddly reluctant to attempt opening the chest despite my curiosity about its contents. So, Ashworth experienced phenomena similar to what we've observed, Thornbury says quietly, yet, apparently, chose not to open the chest himself, leaving it sealed throughout the 20 years he possessed it. Until his death, Holmes adds, looking up from the journal he's been examining. Which occurred how, exactly? The obituary I read mentioned no suspicious circumstances, but perhaps the family or medical records provide additional details. He died in his sleep, Carr responds, having apparently researched this already. Apparently peacefully, no signs of distress or struggle, at age 72. His physician attributed death to heart failure, common enough for a man of his years, though the suddenness was somewhat unexpected, as Ashworth had been in generally good health and actively planning a research trip to the continent. Holmes returns to the journal, reading silently for several minutes before marking a page with a slip of paper. Ashworth became increasingly troubled by the chest's presence during his final year. He reports, his finger tracing entries. Listen to this passage from July of last year. The chest seems almost alive in some strange fashion, emitting a presence that fills my study until I can barely tolerate remaining there. I have moved it twice to different rooms, but the effect follows wherever it resides. Dreams trouble my sleep, visions of dark figures and ancient rituals, of priests chanting in languages I don't know but somehow understand, of warnings about boundaries that must not be breached, and seals that must remain inviolate. Sarah, his daughter, presumably, has noticed my increasing distraction and urged me to consult a physician. But how can I explain that I believe myself haunted by an artifact, stalked by something that waited in darkness for centuries, and somehow knows I possess the object that constrains it? A chill passes through the room that has nothing to do with physical temperature, Watson thinks, seeing similar reactions on his companions' faces. Here is Ashworth's own voice describing experiences remarkably similar to what Thornbury and Carr have reported, establishing a pattern spanning from 1868 to the present, centered on this artifact that has now passed into the museum's possession and responsibility. Did Ashworth consult anyone about these experiences? Holmes asks, continuing to scan the journal entries. Colleagues, spiritualists, anyone who might have provided interpretation or assistance? Thornbury shakes his head slowly. Not that I've discovered in his papers, though we haven't completed comprehensive review of all materials. He seems to have kept these concerns private, perhaps fearing professional ridicule if he admitted believing in curses and hauntings. Holmes closes the journal thoughtfully, his expression abstracted as he processes accumulated information, constructing mental frameworks that might encompass the evidence without requiring abandonment of rational principles. Watson knows this look, has observed it countless times, when Holmes confronts cases that resist simple explanation, when observed facts seem to pull in directions, logical analysis struggles to follow. "I propose," Holmes says eventually, his decision made, "that we conduct a controlled experiment tonight. With your permission, Thornbury, Watson, and I will spend the night in the Egyptian gallery, observing whether phenomena occur under conditions we can directly monitor and document. We'll position ourselves with clear sightlines to the display cases, maintain written logs of all observations timed precisely, and see whether anything manifests that might illuminate whether we face human agency or something rather more unusual." Thornbury looks uncertain, clearly torn between desire for answers and concern for his consultant's well-being. "Are you certain that's wise, Mr. Holmes? If these phenomena prove genuinely dangerous—" "We've faced danger before," Holmes interrupts, not dismissively, but with quiet confidence. "And in any case, direct observation represents the only reliable method for distinguishing between elaborate hoax and genuine anomaly. We cannot solve this mystery through archival research alone. We must confront whatever occurs within that gallery during night hours when phenomena have been reported. I'll arrange access and inform the night staff of your presence." Thornbury agrees reluctantly, "though I insist you have means to summon assistance if needed. The night watchman can be alerted to check on you periodically, and I can provide you with a bell or whistle to signal distress." "Acceptable precautions," Holmes concedes. "We'll arrive at 11 o'clock, after public hours conclude and normal staff depart, position ourselves strategically within the gallery, and maintain vigil until dawn if necessary. Whatever truth lies at the heart of this mystery, tonight we shall pursue it directly." They complete their archival research, Holmes collecting several additional documents for closer study, then depart the museum as afternoon fades toward evening. The rain has finally ceased, though clouds remain thick overhead, and London's streets gleam with accumulated moisture, reflecting gas lamps and shop windows in shimmering patterns that transform familiar thoroughfares into something slightly strange, slightly otherworldly. Watson finds himself simultaneously anticipating and dreading the night's planned vigil. His rational training rebels against granting supernatural explanations any credence, yet the accumulated evidence, Ashworth's journals, Thornbury's experiences, Carr's testimony, the mysterious sand, the impossible object relocation, builds a picture difficult to dismiss through conventional skepticism. Something is occurring in that museum, whether produced by human conspiracy or forces less easily categorized. They dine at a small restaurant near Baker Street, Holmes methodically consuming his meal while clearly abstracted in thought, occasionally jotting notes in his pocketbook, organizing observations and questions for the evening's investigation. Watson attempts conversation, but eventually abandons the effort, allowing his friend the mental space required for his peculiar cognitive processes. Instead, Watson focuses on his own meal, building physical reserves against what promises to be a long, potentially challenging night. Back at Baker Street, they prepare their equipment: lamps, matches, notebooks, watches synchronized to ensure accurate time notation, warm clothing since museums grow quite cold overnight when heating systems reduce output, thermometers to document any temperature fluctuations objectively, rather than relying on subjective perception. Holmes also packs several items Watson doesn't immediately recognize: lengths of thread, talcum powder, a camera with flash powder for potential documentation. You're preparing as though you expect phenomena to occur, Watson observes, watching his friend's systematic preparations. I'm preparing to document whatever does or doesn't occur, Holmes corrects, his tone abstractedly focused. If nothing happens, we'll have established that the phenomena require specific conditions or triggers not present during our observation. If something does happen, we'll have means to record objective evidence rather than relying solely on subjective testimony prone to perceptual distortion. Mrs. Hudson appears in their doorway, her expression concerned. You're going back to that museum tonight? After everything that curator described? Mr. Holmes, surely. We'll be quite safe, Mrs. Hudson, Holmes assures her, his tone affectionate, despite his continued focus on preparations. Museums are fundamentally civilized spaces, hardly the sort of environment where one expects genuine danger. We're simply conducting overnight observation, no more hazardous than the many night watches Watson and I have maintained during previous investigations. She looks unconvinced, but knows better than to argue when Holmes has committed to a course of action. At least take some tea and sandwiches, she insists, already moving toward the kitchen. You'll want something warm during those cold hours before dawn, and heaven knows whether you'll remember to eat otherwise. They depart Baker Street at 10:30, carrying their equipment in leather cases, two professionals embarking on an assignment that could prove routine or extraordinary, impossible to predict which until events unfold. The cab ride through nighttime London feels longer than the morning's journey. The darkness and quiet streets creating impression of greater distance, of passing through zones progressively removed from ordinary life into spaces where unusual events become possible. The British Museum looms before them, its facade dramatically shadowed in the night. Most windows dark, but a few showing light where night staff maintain their vigil. Thornbury awaits them at the entrance, having remained past his normal hours to facilitate their access and provide final instructions. He looks exhausted, Watson notes, the strain of recent days evident in the shadows beneath his eyes and the tension in his movements. Everything is arranged, Thornbury says, his voice low-pitched as though reluctant to disturb the building's nighttime silence. The watchmen know you'll be in the Egyptian gallery, conducting authorized observation. I've instructed them to avoid the area unless you summon assistance, to minimize contamination of your experimental conditions. I've left thermometers positioned at various points, marked with chalk so you can track them easily. The gallery lighting can be controlled from switches near both entry points. I've left several lamps burning at low intensity to provide orientation without destroying natural dark adaptation. He leads them through quiet corridors, their footsteps echoing softly, despite carpeted floors, past darkened offices and silent galleries where artifacts rest in their cases, like sleeping inhabitants of some strange zoo. The museum's nighttime atmosphere differs profoundly from its daytime character. What feels expansive and educational in daylight becomes somehow compressed and secretive in darkness. All those accumulated objects seeming to press closer, their origins and purposes more present, less safely contained behind glass and scholarly interpretation. The Egyptian gallery stretches before them, vast and dim, the few burning lamps creating islands of weak illumination, surrounded by significant darkness. Shadows pool in corners and beneath display cases, the high ceiling disappearing into blackness above. the windows showing only night's darkness beyond the glass. It's a space that invites whispers, Watson thinks, that seems to absorb normal sound and replace it with the peculiar silence of large indoor spaces. Not true silence, but rather a kind of acoustic emptiness that makes one hyper-aware of every small noise. "I'll leave you to your observations," Thornbury says, his reluctance to depart evident despite his fatigue. "Please, gentlemen, exercise appropriate caution. If anything occurs that seems genuinely threatening, don't hesitate to summon assistance. I'll return at dawn to collect your findings and hopefully receive reassuring news that the night passed entirely without incident." He shakes both their hands, his grip communicating concern and gratitude, then departs, his footsteps receding down the corridor, gradually fading until the gallery stands in profound quiet, inhabited only by Watson, Holmes, and the accumulated artifacts of a vanished civilization that somehow feels less vanished here in darkness than in daylight's clarifying illumination. Holmes moves immediately into systematic preparation, positioning their equipment at strategic points, arranging chairs where they can observe the entire gallery while remaining partially concealed behind display cases, laying thin threads across certain pathways that anything passing through would disturb, sprinkling talcum powder in areas where footprints or other marks would register. Watson assists where helpful, but mostly watches his friend's practiced competence, the efficiency of someone who has conducted surveillance many times, who knows how to transform passive waiting into active observation. "Now," Holmes says, completing his preparations, consulting his pocket watch, "we wait." The phenomena Carr described occurred around midnight. Thornbury's encounter approximately 7 o'clock evening. We'll maintain watch through both timeframes and beyond, documenting all observations, however minor they might seem. I'll take first watch while you rest. Not sleep necessarily, but conserve energy, remain alert but relaxed. We'll alternate every 2 hours to maintain fresh perception. Watson settles into his assigned position, a comfortable chair positioned to observe the central display cases, including the one where Carr found the seal positioned. From here, he can see most of the gallery's length, the dim lamps providing just enough light to discern forms and movements while preserving enough darkness that subtle phenomena might manifest without being overwhelmed by illumination. He notices the thermometers Thornbury positioned, showing current temperature of approximately 58 degrees Fahrenheit, cool but not uncomfortable, typical for museums' nighttime conditions. Time passes with the peculiar elasticity of nighttime waiting, simultaneously dragging and rushing, minutes feeling like hours when focused upon, then suddenly revealing an hour has passed when he checks his watch. Holmes sits motionless in his observation post, occasionally making brief notes, but mostly maintaining perfect stillness, his attention completely focused on the gallery and its contents. The silence feels almost tactile, a presence in itself, broken only by the building's occasional settling sounds, the distant whisper of wind against windows, the soft ticking of Watson's pocket watch measuring time's progression. Around 11:30, Watson becomes aware of a subtle change in the gallery's atmosphere. Not dramatic or obvious, but a barely perceptible shift in temperature, in air quality, in the character of silence itself. He glances at the nearest thermometer, seeing its reading has dropped to 56 degrees. A measurable change, though not yet the dramatic plunge Thornbury described. He catches Holmes's eye, sees his friend has noted the same shift, is recording the observation with timestamp in his notebook. The temperature continues dropping slowly but steadily, their breath beginning to show faintly visible in the dim light, the cold seeping through their clothing, despite the warm layers they wore, anticipating this possibility. Watson checks the thermometer again at 11:45, 52 degrees, a 6-degree drop in 15 minutes. Statistically unusual for a large building with controlled environment, though not impossible if heating systems have been adjusted or ventilation altered. At 11:50, Watson hears it, the softest whisper of sound, like sand being poured from a great height, just as Carr described, a continuous gentle rushing that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. He freezes, listening intently, trying to determine direction and source, but the sound remains diffuse, ambient, as though the gallery itself is generating it rather than any specific location within the space. Holmes rises slowly from his position, moving with exceptional care to avoid generating noise that might obscure the phenomenon. Approaching one of the display cases, with his attention fixed on something Watson cannot perceive from his angle. The detective stands perfectly still, then gestures slightly for Watson to join him, the movement barely perceptible, but clearly requesting his companion's presence. Watson crosses the intervening space, his footsteps as quiet as he can manage, joining Holmes before the central display case, the one containing the funerary equipment where Carr reported finding the relocated seal. The sand whisper sound seems slightly louder here, more focused, and Watson notices the temperature has dropped further still, their breath now clearly visible, frost beginning to form on the display case's glass surface in delicate crystalline patterns that spread slowly across the transparency. "Look at the shadows," Holmes breathes, his voice barely above a whisper, and Watson follows his gaze to the floor and walls surrounding the case. There, rendered in the dim lamplight, shadows fall that don't align with any physical objects that could cast them, elongated and oddly proportioned, suggesting human-like forms, but wrong somehow, their angles and movements subtly disturbing. As Watson watches, one shadow shifts position without apparent cause, appearing first on one wall, then instantaneously on another, as Carr described, without traversing the intervening space. Watson feels his heart rate accelerate, his medical training providing no framework for understanding what he observes. These are not hallucinations. Holmes clearly sees them too, and shadows represent physical phenomena, the blocking of light by intervening objects, requiring actual presence to manifest. Yet no objects stand where these shadows suggest. No forms interrupt the space between lamps and walls where blocking would occur. The sand whisper sound intensifies, and now Watson detects something additional. Footsteps, light and irregular, approaching from the gallery's far end where darkness remains most complete. The sounds move closer with deliberate purpose, accompanied by that continuous soft rushing, and Watson finds his hand instinctively moving toward the whistle Thornbury provided for summoning assistance, though he doesn't yet activate it, unwilling to interrupt the observation unless genuine threat manifests. Holmes remains perfectly still beside him, though Watson notices his friend's hands have clenched slightly, the only outward sign that even the great detective feels some tension confronting these impossible phenomena. The footsteps continue approaching, now quite close, and Watson strains his eyes, peering into the darkness, trying to discern what generates the sounds, whether any visible form accompanies the auditory manifestation. There, a movement in the shadows, a disturbance in the darkness that suggests something passing through the space between display cases. Not clearly visible, not distinctly formed, but undeniably present, approaching their position with what feels like purposeful intention. Watson's breath catches, every instinct screaming warnings, while his rational mind struggles to construct explanations. Some staff member playing an elaborate prank, optical illusions created by fatigue and suggestion, anything except the admission that something genuinely supernatural moves through this gallery. The temperature drops again precipitously. Watson's thermometer now reading 48 degrees, a 10-degree reduction, creating winter cold in the late autumn gallery. The frost on the display case's glass surface has spread to cover most of its area, the crystalline patterns beautiful and impossible, forming too rapidly through too dramatic a temperature change for normal physical processes. And then, as suddenly as it began, the phenomena cease. The sand whisper sound cuts off abruptly. The footsteps stop. The shadows return to normal positions, explicable through lamp placement and physical furniture. The temperature remains cold, but stops dropping, holding steady rather than continuing its impossible plunge. The gallery falls silent again, that profound quiet returning, as though nothing whatever has occurred, as though the past 10 minutes were collective hallucination, despite the physical evidence of frost patterns and recorded temperature measurements. Holmes releases a long breath, the tension leaving his frame, his expression showing satisfaction rather than fear or confusion. "Extraordinary," he murmurs, immediately beginning to document observations with rapid notation, capturing details while memory remains fresh. "Watson, your impressions quickly. What did you perceive?" Watson describes his observations in clinical detail, the physician's training providing framework for precise description, even when understanding remains elusive. Holmes nods, recording Watson's account, comparing it with his own perceptions, noting where they align and where they differ. The detective photographs the frost patterns before they fade, measures and documents the temperature readings, collects samples of the talcum powder that shows disturbances suggesting something passed through those areas despite no visible form being observed. "Well," Holmes says eventually, completing his immediate documentation, "we have certainly experienced something remarkable. The question remains whether we've witnessed genuine supernatural manifestation or extraordinarily sophisticated stagecraft, employing methods I don't yet comprehend. The cold, the frost, the shadows, all potentially explicable through technological means if someone had sufficient knowledge and resources. Hidden ventilation, producing localized cooling, projected shadows using magic lantern techniques, recorded sounds played through concealed devices. Yet the coordination would require extraordinary precision, and the purpose remains obscure." "You really believe someone could orchestrate all that?" Watson asks, his skepticism evident. The phenomena seemed so immediate, so responsive, almost alive in some fashion. "What we believe and what we can prove represent distinct categories," Holmes responds, his tone thoughtful rather than dismissive. "I've learned to maintain separation between personal intuition and evidentiary conclusion. My intuition suggests we've experienced something that challenges materialist assumptions, something that exists in categories our scientific frameworks don't yet adequately address. But proof requires reproducibility, documentation, theoretical frameworks that can encompass observations without requiring abandonment of natural law's fundamental principles. They maintain their vigil through the remaining night hours, experiencing no additional phenomena, though the gallery's atmosphere continues feeling somehow charged, expectant, as though waiting for something to occur or resolve. Watson takes his turn at active observation when Holmes requires rest, finding himself surprisingly alert despite the late hour, every sense heightened by the earlier encounter, attention fixed on shadows and sounds with intensity that would quickly exhaust if maintained indefinitely, but remains sustainable for these limited hours. Dawn approaches slowly, darkness gradually yielding to grey light filtering through high windows. The gallery emerging from night's concealment into daylight's clarifying illumination. With morning's arrival, the space transforms back into the familiar museum environment, scholarly, safe, dedicated to education and cultural preservation, rather than mysterious manifestations. Watson feels the tension draining from his shoulders, his body releasing vigilance, as natural light suggests the supernatural realm retreats before rationality's return. Thornbury arrives shortly after 7, his face showing anxious concern, until he observes both investigators appearing unharmed and relatively composed. "You survived the night?" he asks, the question only half joking. "Did anything occur?" "A great deal occurred," Holmes confirms, his tone conveying significant findings. "We experienced phenomena closely matching your descriptions. Temperature drops, unusual sounds, anomalous shadows, a sense of presence that defies easy dismissal. I've documented everything carefully, though interpretation remains challenging. We've confirmed the phenomena are reproducible under observation, which represents important progress. However, we've not yet determined whether their source is human agency or something rather more unusual." He presents his notes and photographic documentation to Thornbury, walking the curator through the night's timeline, showing temperature records and frost pattern images. Thornbury examines the evidence with mixture of vindication and continued concern. Vindication that his reports are confirmed by independent observers. Concern that confirmation moves the mystery no closer to resolution. "So, what do you recommend?" Thornbury asks finally. "We cannot simply leave the seal on display if it generates these disturbances, but neither can we return it to Lord Ashworth's estate now that we've accepted it as a donation. And I confess profound reluctance to destroy an artifact of such historical significance, regardless of its unsettling properties." Holmes stands in thoughtful silence, his gaze moving around the gallery, observing the space in morning light as though seeing it freshly. "I recommend," he says eventually, "that we examine the seal's inscriptions more thoroughly, seeking information about how the original priests intended it to function, whether their texts describe containment procedures or methods for what they would term resealing the boundary. If this object was created to serve specific protective functions, perhaps those functions can be understood and restored through appropriate ritual recreation, not because ancient magic is literally operative, but because the psychological and environmental conditions the rituals create might stabilize whatever forces or energies have been disturbed." "You're suggesting we conduct an Egyptian protective ritual?" Thornbury asks, his tone uncertain whether this represents brilliance or absurdity. "I'm suggesting," Holmes clarifies, "that we treat the artifact according to its original cultural context, creating conditions its creators believed necessary for proper functioning. If nothing else, such an approach respects the object's historical integrity. At best, it might resolve the phenomena through mechanisms we don't fully understand, but can empirically observe. It's an extraordinary proposal, coming from the great rationalist detective, Watson thinks, but somehow appropriate to this extraordinary case that has consistently resisted conventional investigation methods. Perhaps Holmes is correct that some problems require approaching from directions orthodox methodology dismisses, that truth sometimes emerges not from rigid adherence to materialist assumptions, but from willingness to engage with alternate frameworks while maintaining critical observation. I'll need to consult additional sources, Thornbury says slowly, considering the proposal. Reconstructing appropriate ritual procedures will require research into Middle Kingdom religious practices, consulting experts in ancient Egyptian theology and temple ceremonies. But if you believe this approach might resolve our difficulties, I believe, Holmes says carefully, that we must attempt approaches matching the problem's character rather than imposing solutions derived from incompatible frameworks. This artifact emerged from a culture that understood reality through spiritual and magical categories. Perhaps addressing it requires engaging those categories, translating them into actions we can perform, observing whether outcomes confirm or refute their supposed efficacy. They spend the remainder of the morning examining the seal itself once more, Holmes and Thornbury working together to translate inscriptions in greater detail, seeking specific instructions or descriptions that might guide appropriate procedures. Watson assists where possible, primarily providing fresh perspective and asking questions that sometimes illuminate assumptions others hadn't recognized. The inscriptions prove remarkably detailed regarding the seal's creation and purpose. According to texts carefully translated by Thornbury, the seal was commissioned during a period of theological crisis when priests believed the boundaries between realms had weakened, allowing what they termed the wanderer to approach too close to the living world. The seal was created not to destroy this entity, but to anchor the boundary, maintaining proper separation, ensuring that realms remained distinct, and that beings appropriate to each realm remained contained within their proper territories. The ritual of binding, Thornbury reads, translating slowly from hieroglyphics inscribed along the seal's lateral surfaces, required 7 priests of Anubis, conducting ceremonies over 7 nights during the moon's dark phase, invoking the guardian's presence and authority, investing the seal with power to maintain the threshold against all who would cross uninvited. The seal was then positioned at the boundary's weak point. In this case, apparently the tomb where it was eventually discovered, where it would continue functioning indefinitely unless disturbed or removed from its anchoring location. And we disturbed it, Holmes observes quietly, removed it from the location where it had maintained its function for nearly 4,000 years, transported it across continents, opened its protective container, handled it without proper understanding or precautions. Little wonder if the boundary it maintained has weakened, if the entity it constrained has become more active and present. So, to restore proper function, Thornbury continues, following the logical progression, we would need to re-anchor the seal through ritual recreation, re-establishing the conditions its creators believed necessary. But how can we possibly accomplish that? We lack 7 priests of Anubis. We lack the theological knowledge and spiritual authority they would have possessed. We lack the cultural context that made their rituals meaningful. Holmes rises from the examination table, pacing slowly, his mind clearly working through possibilities and problems. We lack the original context, he acknowledges, but perhaps we can create analogous conditions serving equivalent functions. The number 7 appears significant. 7 priests, 7 knights, suggesting numerological importance. The invocation of Anubis as guardian and authority figure, establishing symbolic framework for the ritual's protective purpose. The dark moon phase, representing liminality and transition, appropriate for work involving boundaries and thresholds. He pauses, turning to face Thornbury directly. I propose we attempt a reconstruction. Gather 7 individuals willing to participate. Yourself, Carr, Watson, myself, and 3 others with appropriate scholarly knowledge and serious commitment to the attempt. Wait for the next dark moon phase, which according to my calendar occurs... He pauses, calculating. 3 nights from now. During that period, conduct ceremonies based on our best understanding of ancient procedures, not as literal believers in Egyptian theology, but as practitioners of what might be termed applied anthropology, recreating conditions and observing outcomes empirically. Thornbury looks simultaneously intrigued and doubtful. The museum's trustees would consider this extraordinary, possibly inappropriate. Conducting religious rituals using museum artifacts, treating ancient beliefs as though they might be operative. Then don't inform the trustees, Holmes suggests bluntly. Conduct the attempt privately, after hours, as an experiment in historical reconstruction and problem resolution. If it fails, you've lost nothing but several evenings' effort. If it succeeds, if the phenomena cease and the seal stabilizes into ordinary artifact status, you've resolved your difficulties through unconventional means that need not be detailed in official reports. Watson finds himself nodding agreement despite his rational mind's protests. The case has moved beyond territory where conventional investigation proves effective. They've confirmed phenomena occur, but cannot determine causes or solutions through material analysis alone. Holmes's proposal represents a different epistemological approach, engaging the artifact according to its own cultural logic, rather than imposing external frameworks that clearly don't encompass its properties. I'll need to research the ritual procedures in more detail, Thornbury says, his decision apparently made despite lingering doubts. And recruit appropriate participants, Carr certainly, and I know several scholars who might be willing if approached carefully. 3 nights from now, you say. That provides minimal time for preparation, but perhaps immediacy serves our purposes better than extended planning that would allow doubt and rationalization to undermine commitment. They work through the afternoon, establishing framework for the planned ritual, Thornbury consulting reference texts to determine appropriate ceremonial structures, while Holmes contributes observations about psychological and environmental factors that might enhance effectiveness. Watson initially feels somewhat superfluous to these arcane preparations, but gradually recognizes his contribution lies in maintaining grounded perspective, asking practical questions about logistics and safety that others overlook in their focus on esoteric details. Evening approaches, shadows lengthening through the museum's high windows, and Watson realizes they've spent nearly 24 hours immersed in this investigation, without adequate rest or nutrition. His body makes this neglect known through fatigue and hunger, though his mind remains engaged, racing with thoughts and questions that resist easy resolution. "We should return to Baker Street," Holmes announces, seemingly recognizing his friend's weariness. "The next 3 days will require both research and preparation, and will be more effective after proper rest and meals. Thornbury, I trust you'll contact us if any additional phenomena occur, or when you've finalized arrangements for the ritual attempt." "Of course," Thornbury confirms, shaking their hands with evident gratitude. "Thank you, gentlemen, for taking this matter seriously, for approaching it with both rigor and flexibility. I've presented you with a problem that seems to violate everything modern science teaches. Yet, you've neither dismissed it nor abandoned rational investigation. That balance represents exactly what this situation requires." The cab ride back to Baker Street passes in silence, both Watson and Holmes absorbed in private thoughts, processing the extraordinary experiences of the past day and night. London's streets appear perfectly normal in the early evening light, shopkeepers closing their establishments, workers returning home, street lamps being lit against approaching darkness, the vast machinery of urban life grinding forward with reassuring predictability. Yet, Watson finds himself looking at familiar surroundings with slightly altered perception, wondering what other mysteries might exist beneath the surface of ordinary existence. What other boundaries might prove more permeable than materialist certainty assumes. Mrs. Hudson greets their return with maternal fussing, immediately insisting they consume the dinner she's kept warm, refusing to accept excuses about being too preoccupied for meals. Watson submits gratefully to her management, discovering his appetite sharp once food appears before him, his body reasserting its needs now that immediate investigation pressures have temporarily eased. Holmes eats mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere, occasionally jotting notes or consulting reference volumes he's retrieved from his shelves. After dinner, he retreats to his chemical bench, conducting analyses on the sand samples collected from the museum, occasionally exclaiming softly when results prove interesting. Watson settles into his armchair, intending to read the evening paper, but finding his attention drifting, the day's accumulated experiences replaying in memory with the vividness that suggests they've carved deep impressions on his consciousness. The sand is consistent with Western Desert origin, Holmes reports from his chemical work, but contains trace elements suggesting ceremonial preparation, residual resins, plant oils, mineral additives, consistent with materials used in ancient Egyptian religious practices. This isn't ordinary sand that happened to be present in the tomb, Watson. It was deliberately prepared and consecrated according to ritual procedures, then somehow preserved or reconstituted across thousands of years. Preserved how? Watson asks, his curiosity overcoming fatigue. Material substances degrade, especially organic components like resins and oils. What we found should be long since reduced to basic minerals. Exactly so, Holmes agrees, which suggests either the sand is far more recent than its supposed origin, perhaps modern material artificially aged and planted as part of an elaborate hoax, or it has been preserved through means exceeding normal material sciences understanding. If the latter, we approach territory where ancient Egyptian claims about investing objects with spiritual properties might reflect genuine phenomena operating through mechanisms we haven't yet categorized scientifically. It's a disturbing thought, and Watson feels his comfortable rationalism continuing to erode under this case's accumulated impossibilities. He's a physician, trained in empirical observation and material causation, accustomed to explaining symptoms through physical pathology and treating illness through pharmacological or surgical intervention. But what framework encompasses sand that retains organic components across 4 millennia, shadows that move independently of physical forms, temperatures that plunge 10 degrees in minutes through no obvious mechanism? Perhaps, Watson suggests slowly, voicing thoughts he's hesitated to articulate, perhaps consciousness and physical reality interact in ways our current scientific models don't adequately address. You mentioned Prague earlier, a case involving what you termed resonant emotional energies. What if objects can indeed become invested with properties deriving from accumulated belief, intention, ritual attention across centuries? Not through supernatural intervention precisely, but through natural processes we haven't yet understood or measured. Holmes looks up from his chemical work, his expression showing something that might be approval or recognition. You're suggesting a form of what some theorists term morphic resonance, the hypothesis that patterns of belief and intention can imprint upon physical objects, creating fields or properties that persist and influence subsequent interactions. It's highly speculative, Watson, violating most accepted principles of physics and chemistry. Yet, I confess the hypothesis sometimes seems necessary to explain phenomena I've encountered that resist conventional material explanation. He abandons his chemical analysis, returning to his chair, his pipe emerging automatically, the evening ritual of tobacco and contemplation that signals Holmes settling into philosophical rather than purely investigatory mode. Consider, he continues, smoke wreathing his features, that ancient Egyptian civilization persisted for thousands of years, that millions of people participated in religious beliefs and practices centered on maintaining cosmic order, protecting boundaries between realms, ensuring proper relationships between living and dead, human and divine. Imagine the accumulated psychic weight, if such a term has meaning, of all that sustained attention and intention, focused through ritual and symbol and sacred objects like our troublesome seal. You're suggesting, Watson ventures, that the seal functions not through literal divine intervention, but through accumulated cultural programming, centuries of focused intention creating something approaching objective efficacy. I'm suggesting, Holmes says carefully, that the boundary between subjective and objective may be less absolute than we typically assume, that consciousness and physical reality might interpenetrate in ways creating feedback effects, and that objects serving as focal points for sustained collective belief might develop properties that seem magical, but perhaps reflect natural principles we haven't yet formulated. It's speculation, Watson, not established theory. But this case seems to require speculative frameworks willing to encompass impossibilities while maintaining critical observation. They sit in companionable silence for some time, the fire crackling softly, the room warm and comfortable, Baker Street's familiar surroundings providing reassuring normalcy, even as conversation ventures into territories that challenge comfortable certainties. Watson finds himself grateful for Holmes's partnership in this investigation, his friend's unique combination of rigorous skepticism and willingness to consider unconventional possibilities creates space for exploring mysteries without either dismissing them prematurely or accepting supernatural explanations uncritically. The next 3 days pass in intensive preparation. Holmes conducts additional research into Middle Kingdom religious practices, consulting with scholars at the British Library and the Royal Archaeological Society, gathering information about ritual procedures while carefully avoiding revealing the specific application he's planning. Watson assists where possible and otherwise maintains his medical practice, though he finds himself distracted during consultations, his mind drifting back to seals and boundaries, and the question of whether reality's fundamental nature might be far stranger than Victorian confidence assumes. Thornbury sends daily reports confirming that phenomena continue at the museum. Cold spots appearing unpredictably, sand found in locations where it shouldn't exist, shadows behaving strangely, staff members reporting unease and disturbed sleep. The curator has recruited 4 additional participants for the planned ritual. Carr, naturally, plus Professor Aldridge, who attended the original chest opening, a young Egyptologist named Miss Sarah Pemberton, with particular expertise in religious texts, and interestingly, Lord Ashworth's daughter, Lady Sarah Ashworth Crawford, who apparently maintains scholarly interest in her late father's collections and feels some responsibility for difficulties arising from their donation. The moon enters its dark phase, the optimal period, according to ancient calculations, for conducting boundary-reinforcing rituals. On the appointed evening, Watson and Holmes arrive at the museum well after closing, when staff have departed and only minimal night security remains. Thornbury has arranged privacy for their attempt, informing the watchmen that scholarly work requiring concentration will proceed throughout the night in the Egyptian gallery, and that they should not be disturbed except in genuine emergency. The 7 participants gather in the gallery, where the seal now rests in a carefully prepared space. The floor cleared, markings made in chalk according to hieroglyphic instructions, candles positioned at specific points, creating geometric patterns that ancient texts deemed necessary for containing and directing spiritual energies. In the flickering candlelight, the ordinary museum gallery transforms into something approaching temple space, the accumulated artifacts seeming more present, less safely contained behind glass and scholarly interpretation. Lady Sarah Ashworth Crawford proves to be a woman in her late 40s, her bearing suggesting both aristocratic confidence and genuine intellectual substance rather than dilettante interest. She greets Watson and Holmes with warm professionalism, explaining that she felt compelled to participate after learning of difficulties associated with her father's donation. He spent his final years increasingly troubled by the sealed chest, she relates, her voice quiet but steady, convinced something within it was aware of him, watching him somehow, waiting for opportunity to manifest. I thought him merely aging and subject to imagination's excesses. Now I understand he perceived genuine phenomena my rationality dismissed too easily. Miss Pemberton, a young woman perhaps 25 years of age, with intense scholarly demeanour, has prepared translations of the ritual invocations, rendering ancient Egyptian into English, while preserving what she describes as essential formulaic structures. These texts are not prayers precisely, she explains, her voice carrying academic precision, but rather statements of intention and boundary definition. They articulate cosmological order, specify proper relationships between realms and entities, invest the seal with authority to maintain these distinctions. In performing them, we're essentially recreating the conceptual framework the original priests established. Professor Aldridge, an elderly scholar Watson recognizes from Thornbury's initial account, appears deeply uncomfortable but committed to the attempt. "I maintain profound skepticism about supernatural efficacy," he states firmly. "Yet, I acknowledge we face phenomena exceeding my explanatory frameworks. If ritual recreation resolves these difficulties, I'll accept that outcome while remaining agnostic about mechanisms. Science advances by addressing anomalies, not dismissing them because they prove inconvenient to existing theories." With participants assembled and preparations complete, Thornbury initiates the ceremony, reading translated invocations in measured cadence, while the 7 participants arrange themselves around the seal in the geometric pattern inscribed texts specify. Holmes has positioned thermometers and other measuring instruments to document any environmental changes, maintaining his investigative rigor even while participating in procedures that might seem to violate his rationalist principles. The invocations begin, each participant reading assigned passages in turn, voices creating overlapping pattern of repeated phrases and variations on essential themes. Boundaries must be maintained. The wanderer must remain contained. The guardian's authority must be acknowledged. The seal must be anchored and empowered to fulfill its protective function. The language feels strange in Watson's mouth, alien syllables and concepts, translated imperfectly into English. Yet, he finds himself focusing intently on the words' meanings, willing them toward effectiveness, even while uncertain what that might mean or involve. As the invocations continue through the night's dark hours, Watson becomes aware of subtle changes in the gallery's atmosphere. Not dramatic manifestations like those experienced during their overnight vigil, but gentler shifts suggesting something responding to their ritual efforts. The temperature remains stable rather than plunging into supernatural cold. The shadows behave naturally rather than moving impossibly. Yet the space feels somehow different, charged with attention or intention that wasn't present before. The seal itself seems to change subtly. Its black basalt surface appears less oppressive, less disturbing, as though some quality that made it unsettling has diminished or resolved. Perhaps this is merely psychological projection, Watson thinks, his mind creating perceived changes because he wants the ritual to prove effective. Yet Holmes apparently observes similar transformation, his expression showing satisfaction rather than continued concern. At the ceremony's conclusion, as the first hints of dawn begin filtering through high windows, Thornbury performs the final act, repositioning the seal within its original chest, closing the lid, securing the bronze lock, essentially recreating the sealed containment that existed before the museum received and opened the artifact. "May it remain undisturbed," he intones, the final words of the ancient formula. "May the boundary hold eternal. May the guardian's vigilance never fail." Profound silence follows these words, the gallery suddenly feeling ordinary again, returned to its familiar museum character, the accumulated artifacts no longer pressing so insistently against consciousness's boundaries. Watson releases breath he hadn't realized he was holding, feeling simultaneously drained and oddly exhilarated, exhausted from the night's sustained focus, yet energized by the sense that they've accomplished something significant, even if he can't precisely articulate what that something might be. "Well," Holmes says into the silence, his tone combining satisfaction and scientific caution, "we've completed our experiment in applied anthropology. Whether we've successfully re-anchored an ancient protective seal through ritual reconstruction, or simply performed elaborate theatre that somehow produces psychological resolution, time will tell. I suggest we maintain observation over coming days, documenting whether phenomena cease or continue, whether the seal remains quiescent or continues manifesting disturbing properties. Thornbury agrees, arranging for continued monitoring and regular reports. The participants depart as dawn breaks over London, emerging from the museum into early morning light that seems particularly bright and clarifying after the night's candlelit mysteries. Watson finds himself grateful for sunrise's arrival, for the return of ordinary daylight and familiar streets, even as he recognizes he'll never again perceive reality with quite the uncomplicated certainty he maintained before this investigation began. The subsequent days prove remarkably free of unusual phenomena. Thornbury's reports confirm no further cold spots, no mysterious sand deposits, no shadows behaving impossibly, no staff members experiencing disturbances or unease. The sealed chest sits quietly in secure storage, apparently returned to inert artifact status. Whatever forces or energies associated with it seemingly resolved or contained through their ritual efforts. A week after the ceremony, Watson and Holmes return to the museum for final consultation with Thornbury, reviewing evidence and attempting to construct explanations that might satisfy both intellectual rigor and observed facts. They gather in the curator's office, comfortable surroundings filled with books and artifacts, scholarly atmosphere that feels reassuringly normal after the preceding week's extraordinary experiences. "I've reviewed all documentation carefully," Thornbury reports, his relief evident in relaxed posture and improved complexion, the strain of previous weeks clearly diminished. No phenomena have occurred since the ceremony. Staff members report the Egyptian gallery feels ordinary again, lacking the oppressive quality several had noted but attributed to imagination. The sealed chest has been moved to long-term storage, where it will remain undisturbed indefinitely. I've recommended against any future opening or examination beyond non-invasive analysis. A wise precaution, Holmes agrees, regardless of whether one interprets the phenomena as supernatural manifestation or elaborate psychological effects. The artifact has demonstrated properties exceeding our comfortable understanding, and caution seems appropriate when dealing with systems we don't fully comprehend. "Have you reached conclusions about what actually occurred?" Thornbury asks, his tone suggesting he's less concerned with theoretical explanations than practical resolution, yet still curious about Holmes's interpretation. Holmes leans back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together in that characteristic gesture, his expression thoughtful rather than conclusive. "I've reached working hypotheses rather than definitive conclusions," he responds carefully. "The phenomena we experienced were real, not hallucinations or fabrications, but genuine occurrences producing measurable physical effects and consistent observations across multiple witnesses. The question remains whether these phenomena derived from human agency employing sophisticated deception, or from forces operating through mechanisms our scientific frameworks don't yet adequately address." He pauses, organizing his thoughts before continuing. "The human agency hypothesis requires assuming elaborate planning, technical sophistication, and purposes that remain obscure. While not impossible, this explanation faces significant challenges. The phenomena occurred across multiple locations and timeframes, employed effects difficult to produce through conventional means, and achieved no obvious benefit for hypothetical perpetrators. The alternative hypothesis, that the seal genuinely functions according to principles its ancient creators understood, but we categorize as supernatural, requires accepting that consciousness and physical reality interact in ways exceeding materialist assumptions. I favor, Holmes says slowly, the interpretation that ancient Egyptian priests possessed genuine knowledge about human consciousness and its interaction with physical reality, knowledge they encoded in symbolic and ritual forms we've subsequently dismissed as primitive superstition. Perhaps they understood that focused intention can indeed influence material circumstances through mechanisms operating below normal conscious awareness, that objects can serve as anchors or focal points for these influences, that ritualized procedures can activate or deactivate these connections in reproducible ways. He gestures toward the window, indicating the city beyond. Victorian science has made remarkable progress in understanding material causation. Chemistry, physics, biology, all advancing rapidly through empirical investigation. But perhaps we've been premature in dismissing older knowledge systems that addressed aspects of reality our current frameworks overlook. The mind remains profoundly mysterious, Watson. Consciousness, intention, belief, these generate measurable physiological effects we acknowledge. Yet, we resist extrapolating that these effects might extend beyond individual bodies into environments and objects. Perhaps that resistance reflects limitation rather than wisdom. It's an extraordinary admission from the great rationalist detective, and Watson finds himself both surprised and moved by Holmes's willingness to question foundational assumptions most Victorian scientists defend automatically. Perhaps this is Holmes's true genius, he thinks. Not superior observational skills or deductive prowess, impressive as those abilities are, but rather the capacity to hold certainty lightly, to follow evidence even when it leads toward territories that challenge comfortable conclusions. So you're suggesting, Thornbury ventures, that the curse was real, that ancient Egyptian magic actually functions? I'm suggesting, Holmes corrects gently, that curse and magic represent interpretive frameworks applied to phenomena that might prove natural once we develop adequate scientific understanding. Electricity seemed magical before we formulated theories explaining electromagnetic forces. Radiation seemed impossible before we discovered subatomic structure. Perhaps consciousness and its effects will similarly transition from supernatural to natural once we develop appropriate theoretical models. Meanwhile, Watson adds pragmatically, we've resolved your immediate difficulties regardless of theoretical explanation. The phenomena have ceased. The seal is safely contained. The museum can return to normal operations. That practical outcome matters more than our incomplete understanding of mechanisms. Thornbury nods agreement, clearly satisfied with this resolution, despite remaining questions about ultimate causes and explanations. They shake hands all around, the case officially concluded, even as its deeper mysteries remain only partially illuminated. Watson and Holmes depart the museum for what might well be the final time regarding this investigation, stepping out into afternoon sunshine that feels particularly warm and welcoming after the preceding day's immersion in ancient shadows and impossible boundaries. The cab ride back to Baker Street passes through familiar London streets, the city's ordinary business proceeding all around them, vendors and shoppers, workers and idlers, carriages and pedestrians, the vast, complex choreography of urban life that continues unaware of the extraordinary events that have unfolded within the British Museum's walls. Watson finds comfort in this normalcy, in the return to routine existence, where mysteries remain contained within reasonable boundaries and explanations don't require questioning reality's fundamental nature. Yet he knows something has shifted permanently in his understanding. Some boundary in his own consciousness has become more permeable, allowing entry of questions and possibilities he would have dismissed without consideration mere weeks ago. Reality is larger and stranger than Victorian certainty acknowledges, he thinks, watching London pass outside the cab window. The ancient Egyptians perhaps understood this better than modern rationalists, their cosmology making space for mysteries and boundaries, for guardians and thresholds, for the acknowledgement that existence includes dimensions exceeding ordinary perception and material explanation. Back at Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson greets them with evident relief, clearly pleased to have them home safely after what she certainly perceived as dangerous involvement with supernatural forces. She fusses over them with renewed maternal intensity, insisting they need proper meals and rest, treating them like children returned from hazardous adventure rather than professional investigators completing routine work. Holmes tolerates her attentions with good grace before retreating to his chair, his pipe, his customary evening position by the fire. Watson joins him there, settling into the familiar comfort of their shared sitting room, the gas lamps casting gentle illumination, the fire crackling softly, the rain beginning again outside. London's eternal rain, washing the streets, marking time's passage, the ancient cycle continuing regardless of human mysteries and investigations. An unusual case, Watson observes, understating considerably. Among the most unusual I've encountered, Holmes agrees, smoke wreathing his features. It will require considerable thought before I can articulate conclusions satisfying to both reason and experience. Perhaps I'll write a monograph eventually, on the intersection of ancient belief systems and contemporary phenomena, though I doubt any respectable journal would publish something so apparently credulous and unscientific. Yet you were willing to participate in an Egyptian protective ritual, Watson reminds him, to suspend your rationalist certainty long enough to engage with alternative frameworks. That represents remarkable intellectual flexibility, Holmes, admirable willingness to follow evidence even toward uncomfortable territories. Holmes inclines his head, accepting the observation. The universe is not obligated to conform to my preferences, Watson, nor to Victorian science's confident assumptions about reality's nature. My obligation is to truth rather than comfort, to evidence rather than ideology. If truth sometimes requires acknowledging mysteries exceeding current explanatory frameworks, then so be it. Better honest uncertainty than false certainty masking ignorance. They sit in comfortable silence for some time, each absorbed in private thoughts, processing the case's extraordinary elements and its implications for how they understand the world. The clock ticks steadily, marking time's progression toward night's deeper hours, and Watson feels sleep approaching with pleasant inevitability, his body finally relaxing completely after the preceding day's sustained tension. Will you write this up for publication? Holmes asks eventually, knowing Watson's habit of chronicling their investigations for potential literary treatment. Watson considers the question carefully. Perhaps eventually, he says slowly, though I think it needs time to settle, to find appropriate narrative form that honors the experience's strangeness while remaining accessible to readers who expect detective stories rather than metaphysical speculation. The British Museum affair, or The Curse of the Egyptian Seal, something suggesting Gothic mystery rather than dry archaeological report. But I'll need to reflect further before attempting to capture this case in words that convey its essence without either sensationalizing or diminishing what we actually experienced. Take whatever time you need, Holmes says, his tone suggesting approval. Some mysteries benefit from extended contemplation rather than immediate publication, and perhaps some aspects are better left mysterious, suggested rather than explained, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions about where natural law ends and other territories begin. The evening continues its gentle progression toward night, Baker Street settling into quiet as London prepares for sleep. Watson feels his consciousness beginning to drift, that pleasant state between waking and sleeping, where thoughts become fluid and boundaries permeable, where the day's experiences replay in dreamlike fragments that rearrange meaning and significance. He thinks of seals and boundaries, of ancient priests chanting invocations under desert stars, of guardians positioned at thresholds between realms, of knowledge systems preserved in symbols and rituals that Victorian rationalism dismisses too readily. He thinks of shadows moving independently and sand whispering through galleries, of cold that cannot be explained through ventilation and phenomena that resist material causation. He thinks of Holmes's willingness to question foundational assumptions, to follow evidence toward territories most investigators would refuse to enter. And he thinks, as sleep finally claims him completely, that perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether ancient curses function, or whether consciousness can influence physical reality, but rather how much the universe contains that human understanding has barely begun to map, how many territories exist beyond the boundaries of what Victorian confidence considers possible or real. The fire burns low in the hearth, its flames dancing final patterns before collapsing into embers, and darkness fills the sitting room completely, save for the faint glow of dying coals, the faint light from gas lamps in the street below. Another case concluded, another mystery partially illuminated, another boundary crossed between what is known and what remains, perhaps must remain, forever mysterious. London sleeps, ancient and modern simultaneously, a city built upon layers of previous civilizations, Roman ruins beneath medieval foundations, beneath Victorian streets, the accumulated weight of history pressing upward through pavement and cobblestone. All those vanished lives and forgotten purposes somehow still present, still exerting influence through mechanisms that escape ordinary attention. And in museums and private collections, artifacts from even older civilizations rest in their cases, waiting, perhaps watching, carrying purposes and properties. Their current custodians don't fully understand, cannot fully control, can only approach with mixture of scholarship and humility, investigation and respect. The rain continues falling through the night, that eternal rain, washing away the day's accumulated dust and grime, preparing surfaces for tomorrow's fresh beginning, the cycle continuing as it has for millennia, and will for millennia more, independent of human concerns about curses and boundaries, manifestations and containments, the small dramas that occupy individual consciousness while vast systems continue their ancient patterns overhead and beneath, around and through, always present, yet mostly invisible, mostly unnoticed, except in those rare moments when veils thin and boundaries become permeable, and something from beyond ordinary perception presses close enough to be recognized, acknowledged, perhaps finally understood, or at least approached with appropriate wonder, rather than premature dismissal. Dear listener, our story draws to its close now. The mystery resolved, as much as mysteries of this nature can be resolved, the boundaries restored, the guardian's vigilance renewed through ceremonies older than modern civilization, older than rationalism and scientific materialism, older than the very concept of explanation that we moderns take for granted, as though it were the only valid approach to unknown territories. Perhaps you're drifting now towards sleep yourself, your breathing slowing, your thoughts becoming fluid, boundaries dissolving between waking and dreaming, between conscious control and that deeper wisdom the body possesses, that ancient knowledge older than language about when to release, when to surrender, when to allow consciousness to transform into rest and restoration. Let your mind drift like smoke from Holmes's pipe, like rain against windows, like shadows dancing on walls in firelight's final moments before darkness comes completely. Sleep well, knowing that the world contains more wonders than daily life reveals, more mysteries than science has yet explained, more boundaries to cross and territories to explore. But tonight, let those explorations wait. Tonight, rest in the comfort of this Victorian room, this circle of firelight and friendship, this moment of peace before tomorrow's fresh adventures begin. The seals hold, the boundaries remain, the guardians watch faithfully through the darkness, and you are safe, protected, free to drift into dreams without fear or concern. If you've enjoyed this journey into Gothic mystery and Victorian investigation, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, to like this story, to share it with others who might appreciate tales that honor both reason and wonder, investigation and imagination, skepticism and openness to territories beyond conventional understanding. There are more stories waiting to be told, more mysteries to explore, more boundaries to approach with that mixture of caution and curiosity that honors both safety and discovery. And now, dear listener, I wish you the most restful, peaceful sleep, filled with gentle dreams or no dreams at all, simply the deep restoration your body and mind require. May you wake refreshed, renewed, ready to engage with your world while carrying perhaps some small reminder that reality is larger and stranger than daily life usually reveals, that ancient wisdom sometimes exceeds modern certainty, and that mysteries, properly approached, enrich rather than diminish our experience of this extraordinary existence we share. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well, sleep deep, and may your dreams, if they come, be filled with wonder rather than fear, with discovery rather than danger, with the peaceful resolution of all tensions into rest and restoration. Until we meet again for another story, another mystery, another journey into territories where investigation and imagination interweave, I bid you the gentlest, most peaceful night. Good night.